She built the kingdom with her bare hands, and he thanked another woman for it. Queen Seraphina Ashcroft had carried this throne on her back for 6 years, negotiated the treaties, balanced the treasury, held the border lines when the generals wanted to run. And on the night of the harvest banquet, in front of every noble house in the realm, King Cedric Vallon stood beside his mistress and ordered his queen to say thank you. She didn't. Not one word. And that silence, that single, clean refusal, cost her everything. Stay with me to the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. This one's going to shake you. The banquet hall had been dressed for celebration. 300 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, their light dragging long gold streaks across the polished stone floor, across the white linen of the tables, across the silver dishes heaped with roasted game and autumn squash and bread so fresh the steam still curled off it. Harvest banners, deep crimson stitched with the kingdom's wheat and sword crest, hung from every pillar, swaying in the draft that came through the tall windows. Outside those windows, the capital city was celebrating too. Lanterns floated down the river. Music came up from the lower districts, fiddles and drums, the kind of music that didn't need permission. Inside, the celebration had a different texture. 240 nobles, ministers, military commanders, and foreign trade delegates occupied the long tables. They wore their finest. They drank the good wine Seraphina had sourced herself from the eastern vineyards, a detail nobody would remember by morning. They laughed at the right moments and watched each other sideways with the patient, calculating attention of people who understood that proximity to power was its own currency and that the exchange rate could shift without warning. Queen Seraphina Ashcroft sat at the head table. She had been sitting in this hall for 6 harvest seasons. She knew every crack in the east wall behind the tapestry, knew which candles guttered early because of the draft under the third window, knew the precise angle at which the chandeliers caught the light and threw it back warm instead of cold. She had planned this banquet herself, the seating arrangements, the menu, the order of toasts, the musicians. She had written the diplomatic correspondence that secured 3 of the foreign delegates' attendance. She had reviewed the kitchen accounts 3 times in the week prior, because the head steward had a habit of skimming on bulk spice orders, and she had caught him twice before. None of that was visible on her face. She had learned a long time ago to wear her competence quietly. What was visible, the dark circles she'd covered with powder that was now, 6 hours into the evening, beginning to settle into the creases around her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw from a headache that had been building since noon, the careful, controlled way she held her wine goblet, not drinking from it, just holding it, because she needed her head clear, and she had not eaten enough today, and the wine would go straight through her. She was 32 years old. She had been queen since she was 26. Before that, she had been the second daughter of Duke Ashcroft of the Northern Province, which meant she had grown up understanding that her worth was conditional and that conditions changed without notice. She was thinking about the border reports she needed to review before dawn. There had been movement in the Thornfield Pass that troubled her when she heard the shift in the room. It was not a sound. It was a pressure change. The way a crowd noise alters when something enters a space that doesn't belong there. She looked toward the main doors. Lady Vivian Darcy walked in on the king's arm. Seraphina set her goblet down. She did it slowly, with complete control, because she had known this was coming, had felt it gathering for months the way you feel a winter storm through the ache and old injuries. And she had promised herself that when it happened, whatever form it took, she would not flinch where 240 people could see her do it. Vivian Darcy was 24. She was the daughter of a minor Western lord whose estate was mortgaged to its roof beams, and who had managed, through what combination of calculation and luck, to install his youngest daughter in the king's private rooms 8 months prior. She was beautiful in a particular way, not complicated, not the kind of beauty that accumulated meaning over time, but immediate and uncomplicated, the kind that photographed well and didn't ask anything of you. She was wearing Seraphina's color, not by accident. The gown was deep garnet red, almost exactly the shade the queen traditionally wore to harvest events, close enough that anyone who noticed would notice, and far enough from identical that Vivian could claim coincidence. It was a small blade, expertly placed. Serafina recognized it because she herself was capable of exactly that kind of precision, and it was the first moment all evening that she felt something sharpen inside her beyond the background management of exhaustion and obligation. She recognized it as respect of a sort, the grudging, tactical kind. King Cedric Vallon was 41. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a soldier's posture that he had earned in actual campaign, and then slowly undermined with 6 years of banquets and sedentary administration. He was not a stupid man. That was the important thing to understand about him, the thing that made his choices harder to excuse. He was not stupid, he was proud, and pride had a specific gravitational effect. It bent everything toward the self, compressed complexity into whatever shape was most comfortable. And it did this quietly enough that the man inside it rarely noticed it happening until the damage was already structural. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to perform it. The hall had gone quiet. Not silent, cutlery still clinked, someone coughed, a servant dropped something in the back corridor and caught it before it hit the floor. But the quality of sound had changed. The music had slowed without stopping. Conversations died at the far tables first, rolling toward the head table like a wave pulling back from shore. Serafina watched her husband walk toward her with his mistress on his arm, and she thought about the Thornfield Pass, not as avoidance, as calibration, because the reports had mentioned unusual supply chain movement, wagons heading north in the wrong direction for the season, merchant routes subtly rerouted. And her mind, which had been trained across 32 years to find the load-bearing problems in any situation, had been turning that pattern over since she read it. Something was being moved. Or someone. Cedric stopped at the head table. He did not sit. The remaining conversations in the hall died completely. My lords and ladies, his voice carried well, it always had. Our foreign guests, friends of the crown. He paused. He was good at pauses. He had the performer's instinct, the ability to let silence build anticipation rather than anxiety, and the court had been trained over 6 years to read his pauses as significance. Tonight we celebrate the kingdom's prosperity, its harvests, its strength. Someone at the far end started the polite round of agreement. A murmur, a few raised goblets, and Cedric smiled and let it run, and then lifted his hand and let it quiet again. Much of what we celebrate was built by those who served this crown loyally and without condition. He was looking at her now. Not with hostility, with something more precise, a kind of deliberate public redefinition. And tonight, I want to recognize someone who has brought us something valuable. He looked at Vivian. My Lady Darcy. His voice was warm. For the happiness she has restored to this household, for the light she has brought to these halls. Vivian lowered her eyes with practiced modesty. It is my wish, Cedric said, that the Queen offer Lady Darcy her personal thanks before this court in recognition of what she has given to this kingdom. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Serafina had heard in 6 years. She felt it land, the request, the command, the performance of it. Felt it land and register and expand. Felt the 240 people in the room recalibrate simultaneously, turning toward her with the invisible gravity of a crowd waiting for impact. Felt the heat of the candles and the weight of the garnet gown across the room and the pressure of her own heartbeat, which had not changed its rhythm by a single beat. She looked at Cedric. She did not look at Vivian. She looked at her husband, at the man she had sat beside at this table for 6 harvest seasons, whose treaties she had drafted, whose treasury she had managed, whose generals she had kept in line during the 2 years when he was too grief-stricken after his father's death to perform those functions himself. And she read his face with the fluency of long study. He believed he would win this. He had looked at her and done the calculation and concluded that the fear of public humiliation would be greater than the will required to resist him, and he had made that calculation in front of 240 witnesses, which meant he was not only wrong about her, but had been wrong about her for a very long time. She put her hands flat on the table. She did not stand. She did not speak. The silence stretched. 1 second, 3, 5. The kind of silence that has physical weight, that presses against the skin, that changes the temperature of a room. Lord Harwick, seated 2 chairs down, reached for his goblet and then stopped himself. because movement would have been too loud. Vivian's eyes, from across the table, had lifted. She was watching Serafina with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite uncertainty, something between the two that Serafina filed away without looking directly at it. Cedric's jaw had set. Serafina. Her name in his mouth, and in that register was a command. She had heard it before. She had, in the early years, responded to it. She looked at him and said nothing. The silence became something else. It became a statement. 240 people in that room understood, without her having spoken a syllable, exactly what she was saying, because silence, the right silence, the chosen silence, the one you wear like armor instead of suffer like a wound, communicates more precisely than most words. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him for a long time. She had been careful around him, which was different. She had been strategic and patient and willing to absorb his pride because the kingdom needed the stability and the kingdom was her actual job. But afraid? No. Fear required a belief that the other person had something to take from you that you couldn't rebuild. She had been building things since she was 19. She would still be building when this was over. Cedric pushed back from the table. "You will answer me." His voice had dropped. The warmth was gone. "Before this court, you will answer me or you will answer for this disrespect." "I have nothing to say to Lady Darcy," Serafina said. Her voice was steady. Not loud, she did not raise her voice, but it carried the same way his did, because she had learned that trick too, the diaphragm control, the deliberate pace. She had learned it in a different context, addressing ministers who needed to believe she was worth listening to. She used it now. "The Queen," she said, "does not speak to order." The hall made a sound. Not words, just the collective intake and adjustment of 240 people recalibrating their risk assessment. Cedric's face had gone to red at the jaw and pale at the forehead, which was the specific coloring he developed under sustained humiliation. She had seen it twice before. Once during a failed hunting trip, once during a disastrous negotiation with the Eastern guilds that she had subsequently had to quietly repair, and she recognized it as the point past which he did not think clearly. "You dare!" It wasn't a question. He said it the way men say things when language starts failing them. "You dare in front of this court?" "I have been sitting in front of this court for 6 years," she said. "I am familiar with the format." Someone, she did not see who, made a sound that was almost a laugh and then swallowed it so fast it became a cough. Cedric stepped forward until he was standing directly across the table from her. The candles between them threw his shadow up the wall behind her. "Then you understand," he said, low and deliberate, "what it means when I say that what you have just done constitutes disrespect of the crown. Treasonous disrespect." The word was precise. It had legal weight, and he knew it, and had chosen it. "And I will not have it. Not in my hall. Not in front of my court." Serafina met his eyes. She was thinking even then about process, about what happened next and after that. She had a habit, cultivated across years of managing complex systems, of seeing 3 steps ahead, not with certainty, because certainty was arrogance, but with probability and preparation. She was seeing now. And what she saw was that none of the outcomes available to her in this moment were good. What she also saw was that none of them would be improved by speaking. "Your Majesty may do as your Majesty sees fit," she said. And then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table, not because she was submitting, but because she was done with this particular conversation and she wanted him to know it. "Guards!" The word hit the room like a dropped stone. The 2 royal guards flanking the main doors moved before anyone had time to respond. They were professionals. They did not hesitate, did not look at each other for confirmation, did not scan the room for permission. They moved directly to the head table and positioned themselves at Serafina's sides. She looked up. "The Queen," Cedric said, and his voice had gone flat now, flat and deliberate, "is charged with treasonous disrespect of the crown. She will be held in the lower fortress until her case is reviewed." He looked at her. 7 days. The lower fortress. Not the palace cells, which were uncomfortable but livable, heated, minimally staffed. The lower fortress was the old dungeon, Pre-kingdom, from the era before the current dynasty, when the structure overhead was a different kind of administration. It ran beneath the river's edge. The walls wept. The cold was wet, not dry, which meant it got inside the joints and stayed there. The only inhabitants were men serving long sentences for violent crimes, and the guards assigned there were not selected for their temperament. She had toured it once, in her 3rd year, after a prisoner rights petition from the city council. She had written a full report recommending conditions improvements. Cedric had read it and filed it. She stood up. She did it deliberately, not yanked to her feet, not assisted by the guards, but rising at her own speed, pushing her chair back with controlled care, straightening to her full height, which was average for a woman, but which she had learned to hold in a way that used the room correctly. She was wearing sage green. Her shoulders were bare. She had dressed this evening for the business of a state banquet, which included looking like someone who could not be rattled, and she was grateful for that foresight now. She did not look at Vivian. She did not look at the court. She looked at Cedric, one long, level look, the kind that had nothing in it except clarity. And then she turned and walked with the guards toward the main doors. The hall was absolutely silent. Her heels on the stone floor made the only sound in the room. One step, and then the next, and then the next. And she counted them without meaning to because her mind needed something to hold, and counting was clean and exact. 12 steps to the door. The guards flanked her but did not touch her. She was grateful for that too. She did not look back. Behind her she heard Cedric say, "To the hall, to the assembled nobility of the kingdom, to the foreign delegates, to the candles and the harvest banners and the steam still rising from the bread. The banquet continues." And she heard, as she passed through the main doors and into the corridor beyond, the sound of a room trying to remember how to breathe. The corridor was cold. The banquet hall had been body warm from 240 people and 2 hours of accumulated heat, and the corridor outside was stone and draft, and the smell of torch smoke. Her skin registered it immediately. The bare shoulders, the sage green that was elegant and insufficient, and she pulled the registration away from the surface and stored it somewhere that wouldn't interfere with her thinking. The guards were professional. They did not speak. One walked ahead, one behind, and they moved at a pace that was not quite fast and not quite slow, the institutional pace of people performing a task they've been trained for. She thought about the treasury. Not the abstract treasury, the specific numbers, the quarterly allocations she had reviewed in September, the accounts she had been watching for irregularities. There had been a pattern in the discretionary spending that didn't match the authorized budgets, small enough to read as administrative error, but consistent enough over 3 quarters to suggest it wasn't. She had flagged it for Minister Aldrin 2 weeks ago and asked for a full audit. She had not received confirmation that the audit had been initiated. She should have followed up on that. She filed it. They took her through the Eastern Service Corridor, not the main halls, not the route that would pass the kitchens and the servants' quarters where the staff would be working the banquet cleanup, but the back passage that ran along the outer wall, the one that was primarily used for supply transport. Smart. Whatever the king's failures, his guard captain had the operational sense to avoid a scene. The air got colder as they descended. The corridor gave way to stairs. Stone, uneven, worn at the center where centuries of foot traffic had polished them smooth and slick. And she put her hand on the wall without shame because her shoes were court shoes, not built for this, and falling was a problem she didn't need. The wall was wet. That was the first real thing, not metaphorical, not symbolic, just the physical fact of wet stone against her palm, the temperature of it, the faint smell of mold and river water that came with it. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. Information, useful later. They passed the guard station at the lower level. A table, a lantern, 2 men playing cards who stood up fast when the door opened. She looked at their faces briefly. Both young, both surprised. Neither had been told to expect the queen. That meant Cedric had made the decision at the banquet. It had not been arranged in advance, which meant it was anger, not strategy. Anger was, in her experience, a more dangerous motivation than strategy in the short term and a significantly weaker one over any extended period. Strategy could adapt. Anger burned what it needed and was shocked by the ash. The cell was at the far end of the lower corridor. It was not a room in any comfortable sense of the word. It had 3 stone walls and 1 iron door, a floor that was not quite level, a drain in one corner, and a pallet against the back wall that was wood with a thin layer of straw. The straw was damp. The smell was mildew and something older and darker beneath it that she decided not to catalog in detail. The guard opened the door. She walked in. The door closed behind her. The lock turned. A sound with very specific weight to it. Mechanical, final, the sound of a system completing its function. And she stood in the dark of the cell and listened to the guard's footsteps retreat down the corridor until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down on the pallet, put her elbows on her knees, and let herself breathe. Not breaking down, not falling apart, just breathing. The deliberate, functional kind, the reset, the thing you do when you've been holding a controlled exterior for 6 hours and you finally have privacy. The air in the cell was cold enough that her breath showed, a small pale cloud that appeared and disappeared with each exhale. Her hands were steady. She had checked, pressing them palm down against her knees. Steady. She was grateful for that. She thought about the room she had just left, about the specific quality of the silence when the guards came to her sides, about Lord Harwick's hand frozen on his goblet, about the foreign delegates, 3 of them, 2 from the Eastern Trade Confederacy and 1 from the Northern Mountain Territories, who had watched a kingdom's queen arrested at her own banquet for refusing to speak. She thought about what those delegates would write home. She thought about the Treasury irregularities and the Thornfield Pass, and Minister Aldrin, and the audit that had not been confirmed. She thought about Vivian Darcy and Garnet Red, with her eyes lowered in practiced modesty, and the calculation behind that expression that Seraphina had read clearly and that told her things about the shape of what was coming. She sat in the wet dark of the lower fortress, and she thought, and her mind moved through the information the way it always moved. Not panicking, not freezing, but building, sorting, finding the load-bearing structures in the problem and testing them for weight. She had 7 days. 7 days in which she had no access to ministers, no correspondence, no ability to monitor or influence any of the systems she had been running for 6 years. 7 days in which Vivian Darcy had the king's ear in a palace that was currently celebrating the arrest of the woman who had been holding it together. 7 days in which anything could happen. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the guards. A different rhythm, lighter, more careful. Someone who didn't want to be heard coming, but who also wasn't practiced enough at silence to actually achieve it. She didn't move, didn't stand, waited. A face appeared at the small barred window in the cell door. Young. A woman, a girl, really, perhaps 18, with the plain linen dress of a lower servant and red marks on her hands from dishwashing. She stared at Seraphina with large, frightened eyes. Seraphina looked back at her. "They said not to come here," the girl whispered. The head steward. "He said anyone seen near the lower wing tonight would be dismissed." "Then you're taking a risk," Seraphina said. "Yes, Your Majesty." A pause. "Why?" Seraphina asked. The girl swallowed. She was holding something, a folded piece of cloth, pressed between her hands and the door bars. She pushed it through the gap. It was a wool scarf, dark blue, serviceable, warm. "It's cold down here," the girl said. "My grandmother used to clean these floors, she told me." She paused. "I didn't know what else to bring." Seraphina stood up and took the scarf. It was warm from the girl's hands. She wrapped it around her bare shoulders and felt the difference immediately. Not enough, but something, a material fact. "What's your name?" she said. "Lena. Lena Morrow. I work the kitchen second shift." "Lena Morrow." She looked at the girl's face. Frightened, but here. That was the thing. Frightened in here anyway, which was a specific kind of character. "Thank you," Lena nodded. She started to go, then stopped. "There's something else," she said, low and fast, like someone getting a thing out before they could think better of it. "In the kitchen tonight. After they brought you down. Lady Darcy's woman came into the kitchen, the one who manages her rooms. She gave the head steward a list. She pressed her lips together. I didn't see the whole thing, but I saw names. It was a list of names, Your Majesty. People's names." Seraphina went very still. "Staff," Lena said. "Guards, I think. Some kitchen workers." She looked at her own hands. Some people whose names I knew. People loyal to the household, Serafina said. Not a question, but Lena nodded. She gave him instructions, Lena said. I couldn't hear all of it, but I heard her say, she said that by morning the king would sign the transfers, and after the transfers, those people would be gone. Serafina stood in the wet dark with a borrowed scarf and the cold of the lower fortress pressing through the walls around her, and thought about the treasury irregularities and the Thornfield Pass and the audit that had not been confirmed, and the list of names being passed in a kitchen while she sat here and the 7 days stretching ahead of her. She thought about the shape of a plan that had been in motion far longer than one banquet, and she thought, how many people are on that list? How many have already been moved before tonight? How many of the gaps I've been noticing for 3 months weren't administrative drift, weren't the normal friction of a large institution, but were holes being deliberately cut? Lena, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. How many people in the kitchen know you came here tonight? None, Lena said. I told them I was checking the supply drain in the back corridor. Good. Serafina looked at her steadily. I need you to keep it that way. I need you to go back to your work and behave exactly as you always behave. Can you do that? Yes, Your Majesty. Tomorrow, Serafina said, I need you to find a way to get a message to Commander Bren Halverson. He commands the 3rd Gate Garrison. Do you know who he is? I've seen him, Lena said. Yes. Tell him... She stopped. Thought. Tell him the Queen's monthly review of the grain supply routes has been delayed due to illness, that she asks him to hold the routing report until her recovery. She looked at Lena's face. Exactly those words. No more. Lena's brow furrowed slightly. She was smart enough to know that made no obvious sense, and smart enough to repeat it exactly because she'd been asked to. Exactly those words, Serafina said again. Yes, Your Majesty. There were no grain supply routes that Serafina reviewed monthly. There was no routing report that Halverson held. But Halverson would know that, and Halverson, who had served under her father before transferring to the capital garrison, and who owed his current command to a letter Serafina had personally written 3 years ago, would understand what the words actually meant. They were a code, not one she had ever expected to use. She had set it up 4 years ago, because she was the kind of person who set things up before she needed them, and who had understood, even 4 years ago, that she was building something on ground that belonged to someone else. She had not known the specific form the crisis would take. She had known a crisis would come. Lena pulled back from the bars. She glanced down the corridor, checked it, glanced back. I'll find him, she said. Don't be seen, Serafina said. Don't rush, normal pace, nothing out of the ordinary. Lena nodded and was gone, footsteps receding with that same careful lightness. A girl who had taken a risk and paid it and was now going back to her dishes and her shift, like she hadn't just changed the specific trajectory of the next several days. Serafina sat back down on the pallet. She wrapped the scarf tighter. The wool scratched at her collarbones where the sage green left them bare, and she thought about the treasury numbers, and she thought about Thornfield Pass, and she thought about a list of names being handed to a head steward in a kitchen while the banquet music played overhead, and her mind moved through it the way it always moved, building, sorting, finding the load-bearing structures. Vivian Darcy had made a critical error, not in the plan itself. The plan, whatever it was, might be sound. Serafina didn't have enough of it yet to evaluate it fully, but in the assumption underneath the plan, the foundational assumption that had shaped every decision Vivian had made tonight, there was a flaw, a significant one. She had assumed that arresting a queen was the same as removing her from the game. It was an easy assumption to make. It was the assumption most people in that hall would make tonight, settling into their beds while the candles burned down, reassessing their alliances and adjusting their calculations based on the new power structure they believed they were seeing. It was the assumption Cedric had made when he calculated that she would speak rather than refuse. It was the assumption of people who confused position with capability. Position could be stripped. Capability could not. Capability was distributed. In relationships, in systems, in the 1,000 small decisions and letters and conversations across 6 years that had built a kingdom's actual functioning infrastructure and embedded her judgment throughout it. You could lock the architect in the dungeon. You couldn't undo the buildings she'd designed. Serafina had 7 days. Lena Morrow, with her red-marked hands and her dead grandmother's knowledge of these floors, was out there right now, moving through the palace toward tomorrow, carrying a message that wasn't what it sounded like. Halverson would receive it by noon. Halverson, who she had not spoken to in 4 months, would stand in his garrison office and read an instruction about grain routes that didn't exist, and he would understand immediately what it meant, that she was in trouble, that the contingency was now active, and that he should begin, quietly, unremarkably, through channels that looked like normal garrison administration, the sequence of actions they had agreed on 4 years ago in a conversation that had lasted 40 minutes and that neither of them had ever referenced since. She pulled the wool scarf up to cover her chin. The cell was very cold. She was sitting in the kingdom's deepest dungeon in a court gown and a borrowed scarf, without access to her desk or her correspondence or her ministers or any of the tools she had used for 6 years to manage an empire someone else was credited for. She thought about Vivian's list of names and the transfers Cedric would sign by morning and the specific people she was about to lose access to, and she sorted them by function and priority the way she sorted everything, by what mattered most, by what would be hardest to replace, by what the absence of each person would do to the systems they were embedded in. And underneath that sorting, under the clean functional work of it, something else moved, something older and less organized. The specific weight of a room falling silent, a lock turning. The cold. She had not let herself feel it when it happened. She felt a fragment of it now, the edge of it, the raw physical fact of having been displayed and stripped and locked away by someone who had promised, in front of witnesses and with the full weight of institutional ceremony, to honor her. She sat with that fragment for exactly the amount of time she could afford. Then she put it away and went back to the list. She was going over the possible contents of the Treasury audit, what it would show, who would have had access to authorize the irregularities, what paper trail would exist and where, when she heard it. Down the far end of the corridor. Multiple footsteps this time, heavier than Lena, faster. Official. She heard a door open, heard voices. Male, low, the clipped syllables of men in the middle of a task. She heard something that sounded like a chest being dragged across stone floor. She got up. She stood at the cell door and looked through the barred window down the corridor. 2 guards were opening the cell 4 doors down from hers. The door swung in. One guard carried a lantern. The other was dragging something. No, someone. A man. Gray-haired and heavy, his wrists bound in front of him, wearing the plain dark clothes of a senior palace official. The lantern light caught his face as they pushed him through the door. It was Minister Aldrin, her Minister of the Treasury. The man she had flagged the irregularities to. The man she had asked to initiate an audit. He stumbled over the threshold of the cell. He caught himself on the wall. He turned, and the lantern light caught his face fully, and she saw on it not the expression of a man who had been arrested wrongly. She saw a man who had run out of road. The cell door closed. The lock turned. The guards walked back past her cell without looking in, their boots on the wet stone, the lantern swinging, and then the corridor was dark again. Serafina stood at the barred window for a long time. Aldrin was in the lower fortress, not because he had refused a command, not because of disrespect to the crown, because of what he knew, because of what she had asked him to find and what he had apparently found, and who had found out that he'd found it. The audit had been initiated, and someone had moved to contain it before it could be completed. She pressed her hand flat against the cold iron of the door and felt the specific temperature of it. The lower fortress, the river seeping through the walls, the dark. 7 days. She was no longer calculating whether she could survive this. She was calculating whether the kingdom could. And 4 floors above her, in the queen's chambers that were no longer hers, Vivienne Darcy was writing a letter by candlelight. A letter sealed in red wax that was not the crown's official color, but that of a house far outside these walls, a house Serafina had no current way to name. And a rider was already waiting in the eastern stable yard, his horse saddled, his route marked, ready to leave before dawn reached the Thornfield Pass. The letter was already gone by the time the palace woke up. Serafina did not know that yet. What she knew was the cold which had gotten into her knees during the night and settled there with the patient permanence of something that understood it had time. She had not slept. Not really. She had moved in and out of a shallow, functional rest, the kind of rest that doesn't restore so much as pause, and she had spent the waking hours in the dark doing what she always did with a problem, breaking it into its component weight-bearing parts and testing each one for load. By the time gray light began filtering through the high slit window above her pallet, she had a framework. Not a plan. She didn't have enough information for a plan, but a framework, the bones of one. She heard Aldrin's cough before she heard anything else. It came through the wall between their cells. A wet, deep sound, the kind that comes from a man who has spent a cold night on stone without adequate cover and whose body is registering its objections. She listened to it without moving. Once, twice, then a gap, then again. She stood, moved to the shared wall, and knocked twice with her knuckle. Flat sound. Dull. The knock of someone confirming presence, not trying to be heard at distance. A pause. Then 2 knocks back. She pressed her mouth close to the joint where the wall met the doorframe. The gap there was narrow, but it carried sound better than the stone itself. "How long have you known?" she said. Not loud. The lower fortress carried voices if you weren't careful, and careful was all she had right now. A longer pause this time. 3 weeks, Aldrin said. His voice was hoarse and came through muffled, but clear enough. Maybe 4. I needed to be certain before I brought it to you. You brought it to me when you had a theory, she said, not when you had evidence. I brought it when I had enough to flag it. And then what happened? Another pause. The kind that has shape to it, not empty, but loaded. The pause of a man deciding how much of a bad answer to give. I started pulling the secondary ledgers, he said. The discretionary accounts, 3rd quarter back through 2 years. Someone accessed those ledgers 2 days after you and I spoke. She heard him shift, a scrape of movement on stone. The next morning I was told my access to the Treasury Annex had been suspended pending a review of my own accounts. Serafina was quiet. They move fast, she said. Yes. Faster than someone who didn't already know you were looking. Another pause. Yes, he said again. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The stone up there was dark with moisture, irregular. She thought about the specific sequence. She flags the irregularities, tells Aldrin to audit. Someone is informed of that conversation within a time frame narrow enough to indicate either direct surveillance of her office or a source inside her immediate staff. Aldrin's access is stripped. Within weeks, she is arrested at a public banquet on a pretext that is technically legal and immediately effective at removing her from any position of oversight. The audit is dead. The person who would conduct it is in the cell beside her. And she is here, with 7 days on the clock, with no desk and no correspondence and a wool scarf borrowed from a kitchen girl. Aldrin, she said, what did you find before they cut your access? A long pause this time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. The withdrawals started 22 months ago, he said. Small at first, the kind of number that reads as administrative rounding in a ledger that size. Then they got regular, systematic. Monthly draws from the discretionary fund routed through 3 separate accounts, 1 legitimate, 2 that I couldn't find origin documentation for. How much total? As of the last figure I saw, she heard him exhale. Somewhere between 40 and 60,000 crown. I didn't have the full picture. 60,000 crown. She did not react to that out loud because her voice was the only thing she had complete control over right now, and she was not going to waste any of it on a reaction she'd already processed internally. 60,000 crown was a border garrison's annual operating budget. It was enough to hire a significant number of foreign soldiers for a significant amount of time. It was enough to do quite a few things she did not want to think about in precise terms yet, because she still didn't have the full shape, but she was beginning to see it. Get some sleep if you can, she said. Serafina. His voice had changed, flatter, more personal than he usually allowed himself. What are we dealing with? She thought about Lena Morrow and the message to Halverson, and the rider that had left the eastern stable yard in the dark. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and the specific value of managing the distance between those two things carefully. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true. "But we're going to find out." She pushed off the wall and went back to the pallet and sat down and thought. The first visitor came mid-morning. She heard him before she saw him. A single set of footsteps, unhurried, with the confident weight of someone who was authorized to be here and wanted that understood. The door opened, not the cell, the corridor door, and the footsteps stopped outside the barred window. Captain Orrin Fisk, the King's personal guard captain, 43, lean, with a short gray beard and eyes that assessed everything as a potential threat, which was both the quality that made him excellent at his job and the quality that made him exhausting to be in a room with. He looked at her through the bars. She looked back. "Captain," she said. "Your Majesty." A pause. He said the title with complete neutrality. Not sarcastic, not deferential, just technically accurate and completely uncommitted. "You have been asked to consider a statement of apology, to be submitted to the King's office in writing, reviewed before the Council, and, if accepted, read aloud at the next court assembly." Asked by whom? His Majesty. "And if I submit the statement?" "Your sentence is reconsidered. The matter is closed." She looked at him. "The statement," she said. "What would it say?" "Acknowledgement of disrespect, recognition of the King's authority, an expression of personal gratitude to Lady Darcy for her contributions to the royal household." He said it the way men recite things they've been given to recite and find professionally distasteful. His face was perfectly flat. "And a commitment to conduct appropriate to your position going forward." She was quiet for a moment. "Fisk," she said, "how long have you served this crown?" A small pause. 18 years, Your Majesty." "In those 18 years, have you ever seen a queen of this kingdom apologize to a mistress?" His jaw moved slightly. Not an expression, just a micro-adjustment of the muscles there. "No," he said. "Then you know this statement is not about an apology." Another small pause. "I was asked to deliver the offer," he said. "I've delivered it." "Tell His Majesty that I appreciate the consideration," she said, "and that I'll need more time to compose an adequate response." That bought her nothing concrete except time, and only a small amount of it, but small amounts of time had specific value when used correctly. Fisk looked at her for one more beat, the look of a man filing something away, and then he turned and walked back up the corridor without further comment. She listened to his footsteps until they were gone. The afternoon brought something she had not anticipated, the sound of voices from the upper corridor, not official this time, not the institutional cadence of guards and emissaries. These were uneven. Multiple speakers overlapping, the specific acoustic texture of people arguing in low voices about whether they should be doing what they were doing. 3 people appeared at the corridor door. She recognized 2 of them. The first was Gerhardt, one of the Third Gate garrison guards, mid-40s, big across the chest, with a soldier's economy of movement and a face that had been broken at least twice and healed imperfectly. He had served under Halverson for 11 years. He was carrying a canvas bag. The second was a woman she knew less directly, Marin, one of the senior household archivists. 50-ish, small, with the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent 30 years leaning over desks. She had served in the palace since the previous reign. She was carrying nothing visible, which meant whatever she had brought was on her person. The third was a young man she didn't recognize at first. Then the junior clerk from Aldrin's outer office, barely 20. He was sweating visibly despite the cold of the corridor and looking at the other 2 like a man who had been peer-pressured into something and was only now fully understanding what. The lower fortress guard let them through with the specific expression of a man deciding to be somewhere else in his memory. They came to her cell door. Gerhardt set the canvas bag down and looked at her through the bars. "Commander Halverson sends his regards," he said, low, flat. "And the routing report." "Tell him the supply lines are holding," she said. Gerhardt nodded once. Then he reached into the bag and produced a wrapped bundle, cloth around something hard-edged. He passed it through the bars. Inside, a dry wool blanket, a bread roll that was still warm, a small corked flask of something. And underneath those, wrapped separately in oilskin, a bundle of papers. She set the food aside and looked at Marin. "What did you bring?" she said. Marin glanced at the young clerk, then back at Serafina. She reached into her coat and produced a slim folder, the kind used for archival documents, cream-colored, tied with a black cord. "I pulled the original charter documents for the Darcy House registration," she said. "When Lady Darcy's household staff were formally registered to the palace rolls 8 months ago, they went through standard documentation: name, origin, prior household, letters of reference." She passed the folder through the bars. "I cross-referenced them yesterday," Marin said, "before everything started locking down. 3 of the 6 reference letters came from the same house, a house in the Western Territories." "Which house?" Marin's mouth pressed thin. "House Varent." Serafina did not let her face move. "House Varent." The Western Territory lords who had contested the current dynasty's authority over the river trade routes for 20 years, who had lost 3 successive legal challenges, and had, to all visible appearance, accepted the kingdom's authority and withdrawn into their lands and their grudges, who she had flagged 2 years ago as a potential long-game problem, who she had flagged in a private memorandum she had sent to Cedric directly, marked for his eyes only, and which he had, she knew now with the clarity of retrospect, almost certainly never read. "Does anyone else know you pulled these?" she said. "No," Marin said. "I pulled them before the new archive access restrictions came through this morning." "New restrictions?" "Effective this morning," Marin said. "Archival access for Treasury and Foreign Relations files requires countersignature from the King's Secretary going forward." She paused. "His Majesty signed the order last night." "Last night, while Serafina sat in this cell." "Who filed the order?" Serafina said. "It was prepared by Lady Darcy's administrative secretary," Marin said. "Countersigned by Minister Hadley." Hadley, the Minister of Interior, a man she had considered largely harmless, bureaucratic, risk-averse, the kind of official who served whoever signed his salary. She had miscalculated him, not as a threat, but as a tool. Someone had correctly identified him as movable and had moved him. She looked at the young clerk, who was still sweating. "What's your name?" she said. "Corvin, Your Majesty. Peter Corvin. I was in Minister Aldrin's outer office." "Was," he swallowed. "I was reassigned this morning to the correspondence sorting hall." She looked at him for a moment. Young, scared, here anyway. Same equation as Lena Morrow, different math. "Corvin," she said, "did you see anything before your reassignment? In the office? In the files?" He glanced at Gerhardt, then back at her. "There was a courier," he said. "Yesterday evening. I was still there. I was working late. I do that. And a courier came to the minister's office. Not through the main hall, through the service entrance." He pressed his lips together. "He was carrying a diplomatic pouch. The seal on it, I saw it briefly. He wasn't trying to hide it exactly, just moving fast. The seal wasn't any house I recognized." "Describe it." "A wheel," he said. "Like a wagon wheel, but 8 spokes instead of 6. In red wax." Serafina was completely still. 8-spoke wheel. Red wax. Not a domestic house seal, not a merchant house. A sigil she had seen in one context and one context only, in the intelligence briefings from the kingdom's eastern border correspondence, in the section detailing the organizational marks used by the Confederacy of Free Cities, the eastern trade bloc that had been quietly expanding its influence into the kingdom's eastern merchant routes for 3 years, and that had been the subject of exactly the supply chain anomalies she'd been tracking in the Thornfield Pass data. Domestic treasury irregularities, House Varent placing staff in the palace, and now a courier bearing an Eastern Confederacy seal making a nighttime visit to the Treasury Minister's office. 3 separate threads, each one she had noticed independently, each one she had treated, until this moment, as a separate problem. They weren't separate. She felt the shape of it click into place the way a mechanism clicks when the tumblers align, Not with satisfaction, not with the relief of resolution, but with the specific cold clarity of understanding something you would have strongly preferred to be wrong about. This was not Vivian Darcy. Vivian was a piece of it, an instrument, placed well, used effectively. Someone had assessed Cedric's specific weaknesses with accuracy and exploited them. But Vivian didn't have the infrastructure to move 60,000 crown through layered accounts. She didn't have the network reach to coordinate Eastern courier seals with Western house placements with archival access restrictions on the same night. She was 24 years old and the daughter of a mortgaged lord. She was the visible part. Someone else was the weight behind it. "All three of you," Serafina said, "listen carefully." She looked at each of them in sequence. Gerard first, steady, professional, receiving. Marin second, pale but focused. Corvin last, scared but holding. "You need to leave this corridor and return to your positions, and you need to do it without discussing what happened here. Not with each other, not with anyone." She held Corvin's gaze specifically. "I don't care how much someone you trust asks. You were checking on a colleague. You were in the wrong corridor. You left immediately." "Your Majesty," Gerard said, "the commander asked what you need." She thought. "Tell him to review the garrison assignment records for the last 6 months," she said. "Any transfers of men from the eastern gateposts. Any new assignments that came through Minister's office rather than the standard garrison chain. He'll know what to look for." She paused. "Tell him to be quiet about it." Gerard nodded. "Marin," she held up the folder. "Did you make copies?" "Originals only," Marin said. "Safer." "Keep looking," Serafina said. "Darcy household records. Any correspondence that went through official channels in the last year. Anything touching the Western land grant reviews." She met the archivist's eyes. "Can you do that without being caught?" Marin considered it with the specific precision of a woman who had spent 30 years being underestimated by people who thought archivists were furniture. "I can do most of it," she said. "Most is enough for now." They left. The corridor door closed. The lower fortress settled back into its wet silence. Serafina sat on the pallet with the oilskin papers and the folder from Marin and the wool blanket across her shoulders over Lena's scarf, and she worked. She worked the way she had always worked, not by waiting for all the information to arrive before making decisions, because all the information never arrived, but by building forward from what she had into the space she needed to reach. She read what Gerard had brought, 2 documents, copied in a hand she recognized as Halverson's personal clerk, pulled from garrison records. A list of transfer orders, 23 names, all Eastern Gate assignments, all processed in the last 4 months through a ministerial channel rather than the garrison command structure. 23 men moved out of the Eastern Gate posts. The Eastern Gate posts that faced the Thornfield Pass. She looked at the bread roll in the flask and decided that she needed to eat because she had not eaten in approximately 18 hours, and her body was going to start making poor decisions on her behalf if she didn't give it something to work with. She ate without tasting it. Drank from the flask. Water, with something added, ginger maybe, the kind of thing a garrison kitchen would put together for a long shift in cold weather. She thought about Cedric. This was the part that required the most careful handling, because Cedric was not stupid and she kept coming back to that. He was proud, and pride had bent his perception, but underneath the pride was a man who had run military campaigns competently, and who had, in the early years of the marriage, shown genuine instincts for governing. Those instincts had atrophied under 6 years of being surrounded by people who found it professionally convenient to tell him what he wanted to hear. He had not engineered this. She was increasingly certain of that. What had happened at the banquet, the specific form of it, the public performance of her humiliation, that was Cedric's pride, genuinely his own, operating exactly as it always operated. Vivian had provided the occasion, and Cedric had provided the execution, and neither of them had needed a script because it had emerged from exactly the dynamics that already existed. But someone had been waiting for it. Someone had been watching those dynamics. Cedric's pride, his susceptibility to flattery, his habit of using public displays to reassert authority he felt uncertain about, and had placed pieces accordingly. Vivian's arrival 8 months ago, the Treasury withdrawals starting 22 months ago, The Eastern Gate reassignments beginning 4 months back. A patient, staged, multi-front operation that had used the existing fracture lines in the palace rather than creating new ones. That was sophisticated. That was the kind of sophisticated that required time and resources and intelligence capacity she needed to account for. Which meant there were people inside this palace she didn't know about, not just Vivian's visible staff, people embedded deeper, people who looked like furniture. She stared at the ceiling. She had 5 days left. 5 days was not a lot of time, but 5 days was also not nothing. 5 days was enough for Halverson to pull the garrison records and understand what he was seeing. Enough for Marin to locate additional documentation in the archives. Enough for Corvin, who she had not dismissed as an asset despite his youth, because youth combined with access and the specific courage of showing up anyway had specific utility, to watch the correspondence channels from his new position in the sorting hall. It was enough, possibly, to build a case. The problem was that building a case only mattered if there was someone to present it to, and the only judicial authority she had access to was Cedric. She thought about Fisk's visit, the apology offer. She thought about what it meant that the offer had been made at all, because if she were truly neutralized, if she were simply a liability to be stored, there was no need to offer her a way out. You only offered an exit to someone whose continued existence in their current state was a problem. They were not entirely comfortable with her being here. That was information. She was turning that over, examining it, testing it, when she heard the commotion upstairs. Not clearly, just sound, filtered through 3 levels of stone. Voices raised. Something falling. The specific acoustic signature of people in a hurry going in multiple directions at once. She stood up and listened. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped. Not gradually. Abruptly, the way things stop when a decision is made. Then footsteps on the lower stairs. Fast. Not a guard's pace. Irregular. The corridor door came open hard. It was Lena Morrow. Not careful this time. Not the quiet, careful movement of someone crossing a kitchen corridor at night. She was breathing fast, her face flushed, her eyes doing the thing eyes do when someone has just seen something they're still processing. She came directly to Serafina's cell door. "What happened?" Serafina said. "The North Hall," Lena said, catching her breath. 20 minutes ago. Lord Harwick, the one who was at the banquet, near the head table. I know who Harwick is. He came to the king's receiving room, with witnesses. 4 of them, all senior lords. He told the king. She pressed her palm flat on the doorframe, steadying herself. He asked for you to be released. He said what happened at the banquet was... He said it was improper. He said the court had a right to know the charges were reviewed by the full council before... What did the king say? Lena looked at her. He dismissed Harwick from his seat on the advisory council, she said, effective immediately. He stripped his land appointment in the Eastern District and... She stopped. And, Serafina said, and he told the room that anyone who questioned the Queen's sentencing would be considered to be questioning the Crown directly. Lena's voice had gone very flat, the way voices go when they're reporting things they need to hold at a distance to get out. He said any further interference would be treated as an act against the state. The cell was very quiet. Harwick had been one of the king's oldest allies. 20-year relationship, 2 military campaigns together. He'd been at Cedric's father's deathbed, and Cedric had stripped him in front of witnesses in under 20 minutes. That was not pride. Or not only pride. That was fear. Cedric was afraid of what a full council review would find, which meant Cedric knew, on some level, whether he'd been told directly or had simply registered the shape of things through proximity, that there was something in his administration that would not survive scrutiny. He might not know what. He might not know who. But he knew. Lena, Serafina said, did Harwick say anything before he left the room? He said, Lena frowned, reaching for the exact words. He said that a crown that jails its foundations does not stand long, and then he walked out. She was quiet for a moment. Then, get back to your shift, she said. Now, don't run. Lena went. The door closed. Serafina stood in the center of the cell and felt the specific weight of the shift that had just occurred. She had been calculating based on a structure in which Cedric's authority, however wrongly applied, was stable, in which the court would do what courts do: absorb the shock, adjust their alignments, wait to see how the power settled, in which she had 7 days to build something before she needed to use it. That structure had just changed. Cedric was not waiting, he was reacting. He was cutting the threads that might unravel things. Aldrin in a cell, Harwick stripped, archive access locked, eastern gate posts cleared, and he was doing it fast, which meant either he understood more than she'd estimated or someone was guiding his cuts for him. Either way, the window was narrowing, and somewhere in this palace, a letter sealed with a wheel and 8 spokes had been received last night. Corvin had seen a courier. She had the seal, she had the timeline, she had the treasury numbers and the garrison transfers and the Darcy House connections to Varant. But she did not have the letter. She did not have the explicit link, the thing that would turn a pattern into a case. She sat back down. She pressed her hands together between her knees and felt them. Steady, cold, present. And she thought, 5 days. The window was narrowing, but it had not closed. Not yet. Halverson had the garrison records. Marin had the Darcy documentation. Corvin was in the correspondence sorting hall. And somewhere in this palace, in a chest, a desk, a courier bag that had not yet been destroyed, was the letter. She needed that letter. She was still thinking about how to get it when she heard, from far above her, the sound of the palace gates opening. Heavy iron, the groan of old hinges. She had heard that sound 1,000 times from the Queen's chambers. From down here it was different, deeper, more distant, just the vibration of it through the walls. She counted. The main gates opened for supply deliveries twice a day. This was not a supply hour. And then, just audible, just at the edge of what she could hear through 3 levels of stone, hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Moving fast. Coming in, not going out. Arriving. She looked at the high slit window. The light through it had gone thin and gray with late afternoon. Who arrives at a palace in force in the late afternoon, through main gates, unscheduled? She knew before she finished framing the question. Not guests, not trade delegates. The hoofbeats stopped. The gates groaned again, closed. And then silence. A different silence than before, not the empty silence of a cold dungeon, but the held breath silence of a building that has just received something it cannot yet account for, pressed down through the stone above her like weather, like the pressure change before a storm breaks. She stood up. The piece she hadn't yet placed. The piece that connected 60,000 crown and an 8-spoke seal and eastern gate posts emptied of their veteran guards. She understood now what the money had been for. There were soldiers inside these walls, and they had not come for her. She counted the horses by sound. It was the only instrument she had. Through 3 levels of stone and the wet corridor walls and the specific acoustic distortion of the lower fortress, she filtered what she could. Hoofbeats on the cobbled yard, the creak and clank of gear, voices with an edge to them that was not the comfortable edge of a palace garrison going through its routines. These were men who had just arrived somewhere after a long ride, and who were in the process of establishing themselves in a space that did not yet belong to them. She counted 22 horses. Maybe more. Sound was imprecise. 22 mounted soldiers arriving unscheduled through the main gates in the late afternoon was not a diplomatic visit. She stood in the center of the cell and thought about the 60,000 crown, about the eastern gate posts emptied of veterans, about the 8-spoke seal on a courier bag in the dead of night, and she put those pieces next to the sound of soldiers establishing themselves in the outer yard, and the shape she got was very clear. Too clear to want to look at directly. But she looked. This was a seizure. Staged in layers, built over 22 months, and the final piece, the physical piece, the piece you needed when all the administrative maneuvering was done, had just ridden through the front gate while the palace was still occupied with processing the spectacle of a queen in chains and an old lord stripped of his seat and a king cutting threads faster than he could think. The question was whether anyone upstairs understood what had just arrived. She moved to the door and knocked twice on the shared wall. Aldrin knocked back. "How many men does the inner palace guard run on a standard evening shift?" she said. A pause while he calculated. 12 at the gates, 8 in the main corridor posts, 4 at the king's quarters, 2 roving. He paused again. Maybe 30 total inside the walls. 22 riders she'd counted. Probably more she hadn't. Aldrin, she said, think about the treasury accounts. The 60,000. What's the most efficient use of that number for what you'd need to pay men of that specific type to do a specific job for a defined period? A long silence. Mercenaries, he said. Professional company. 6 months of operating costs, including supply, for a force of 30 to 50. There it was. She stepped back from the wall. The lower fortress had one point of contact with the rest of the palace, the guard station at the top of the stairs and the corridor door beyond it. Whoever controlled that controlled access in both directions. And the guards at that station were palace garrison, the same garrison from which 23 men had been quietly transferred out of the eastern posts over the last 4 months, replaced with men she hadn't vetted, men who had come through ministerial channels rather than the standard garrison command. She thought about Halverson, about whether he had moved yet, whether the garrison records had told him what they needed to tell him, whether he had understood the timeline fast enough to do anything about it before the gates closed. She thought about Lena Morrow going back to her dishes. She thought about Gare Art, who was somewhere in this building right now, and Marin in the archives, and Corvin in the correspondence hall. She had sent people into a building that now had soldiers in it. The thought landed with a weight that was not guilt exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific weight of decisions made on incomplete information, where the incompleteness was not carelessness, but was the irreducible limit of operating in the dark, and where the gap between what you knew and what you needed to know had just become the thing that could get people killed. She sat down. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and held them there and breathed. You cannot undo what is already in motion. What you can do is determine what you do with the next minute and the one after that. The corridor door opened. Not a knock, not announced, just the sound of the bolt and then the door swinging hard and footsteps, multiple sets, fast, coordinated, coming down the corridor toward her cell. She was on her feet before they reached her. 4 men. 2 she recognized as palace guards, not the usual lower fortress staff. These were outer corridor men, reassigned. One she didn't recognize. Heavy build, close-cropped dark hair, road dust still on his coat, the kind of face that had been professionally blank for so long, blankness had become its default expression. The 4th man was Fisk. Fisk's face told her everything. He looked like a man who had lost an argument he had known he was going to lose and was now doing what he was told with the specific expression of someone storing everything for a later accounting. The cell door opened. "Captain," she said. "You're being moved," Fisk said. He did not look at her directly, which was its own form of communication. "King's orders, council chamber." "The emergency council," she said. He said nothing. "Charges have been filed," she said. It was not a question. "You are required in the council chamber," he said. She looked at the man she didn't recognize. Road dust on his coat. He had arrived with the horses. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at her with the professional blankness and did not answer. She took the oilskin documents from the pallet and folded them inside the wool blanket and left them there. She folded Lena's scarf and left it on top of the blanket. She straightened her court gown, sage green, 2 days old now, wrinkled at the skirts, the neckline stiff with the cold, and she walked out of the cell without assistance. The corridor smelled different, not the usual lower fortress smell of damp and old stone. Something else layered under it now. Horses, leather, sweat that wasn't hers. The smell of men who had traveled. They took her up. The palace above the lower fortress was wrong. She knew it the moment they came through the service corridor into the main eastern hall. She could not have articulated every specific element immediately, but her body registered it before her mind finished the analysis. The quality of movement in the space, the positioning of guards at the hall junctions, the specific way people stopped when they saw her coming and then looked at the floor and found reasons to be somewhere else. There were unfamiliar faces at the hall posts. Not many. Enough. Placed at the intersections, at the doors, at the staircases, the points of the building that, if you needed to control movement through a large structure quickly and with a small force, you would prioritize. The inner palace was being managed. She walked with the guards and kept her face neutral and looked at everything. She counted the unfamiliar faces. She noted their positions. She noted which of the palace staff were visible and which weren't, the gaps in the normal foot traffic of a working afternoon, the absent clerks and servants, the missing familiar faces. She noted who was still standing at their posts, looking straight ahead, with the careful posture of people who had been told very clearly what would happen if they did anything other than stand at their posts and look straight ahead. Marin was not visible. That could mean anything. It could mean she was in the archives. It could mean something else. She did not let herself think about what else. The council chamber was on the 3rd floor. She had sat in it hundreds of times. It was a long room with a high ceiling and narrow windows and a central table that seated 16, with additional chairs along the wall for observers. The table had a specific geography: the king's seat at the north end, the queen's seat to his left, ministers filling the remaining seats in descending order of seniority. The king was there. All 14 ministerial seats were filled. She scanned faces quickly as the doors opened. Who was present? Who was absent? Who was present but not in their usual seat? 4 faces she didn't recognize, seated along the wall in the observer chairs, not at the table, but present. Road dust. Cedric was standing. He was in formal court dress, which meant someone had dressed him for this. It was not an impromptu council. This had been prepared. Vivienne Darcy was standing to his right, not in the observer chairs, not behind the king. To his right, in the space where Serafina herself would stand during joint court addresses, standing there with the deliberate placement of someone demonstrating an arrangement. Serafina walked to her position along the wall, not the queen's seat. She was under arrest. She had no seat, and she stood and looked at Cedric and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was working slightly. He had the flushed jaw, pale forehead coloring again, but underneath it something she hadn't seen before. A flicker of something that was not quite doubt and not quite fear, but occupied the space between them. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know what. Serafina Ashcroft. He used her family name, not her title, the formality of a criminal proceeding. You stand before this council charged with conspiracy against the crown. She said nothing. Let him continue. Evidence has been provided to this council. He glanced at someone she couldn't see from her position, someone to his left, demonstrating that during your tenure as queen, you maintained unauthorized correspondence with foreign parties, specifically with agents of the Eastern Confederacy of Free Cities. The room was completely still. She felt the charge land, and she felt the specific shape of it, the way a well-made trap feels when you finally see its architecture, the involuntary appreciation of the engineering before the anger catches up. They had used her own investigation against her. She had been tracking the Eastern Confederacy's infiltration. She had correspondence. She had notes. She had, in the ordinary course of trying to understand what was moving through the Thornfield Pass, sent inquiries through trade channels and received responses from Confederacy-adjacent brokers, because that was how intelligence worked. You put your lines in the water, and you waited, and you read what came back. Every one of those letters, read in isolation, without the context of what she was investigating and why, looked exactly like what she was now being accused of. 48 hours. She had been in that cell for 48 hours. Long enough for someone to go through her office, pull her correspondence, and select from it the specific documents that, out of context, built the case they needed. The charges are further supported, Cedric continued, and his voice had the cadence of a man reading words someone else had given him, by the testimony of Minister Aldrin, who has provided a full account of his activities on your instruction, including the unauthorized review of Treasury documents and the redirection of funds to external parties. Aldrin. The word arrived like a stone through glass. She did not move. She kept her face exactly where she had placed it, neutral, present, registering without displaying. And she thought, Aldrin gave testimony. In the last 48 hours, from the cell beside mine, Aldrin gave testimony. And then the next thought, arriving immediately behind the first. Or someone gave testimony on his behalf. She did not know which. She would not know until she could see his face, and Aldrin was not in this room. As a result of these charges, Cedric said, and in accordance with the council's authority under the kingdom's founding charter. He paused. He reached for the document on the table in front of him. He picked it up. He held it without looking at it, and for just a moment, just the fraction of a second before his expression reset, she saw the man behind the performance, uncertain, pushed to a point he had not fully chosen, standing at the edge of something he understood was permanent, and looking at her with the specific expression of a person hoping, at the last possible moment, to be stopped. She saw it. She did not move. An order of execution has been prepared, to be signed before this council and carried out within the time period specified by the charter. He looked down at the document. The sentence is to be carried out in 3 days. 3 days. The number landed differently than she had expected. Not as shock. She had seen this coming, had understood the trajectory, but as a precise and material fact, the way a doctor announces a timeline, and the timeline becomes real by being spoken. 3 days. She looked at him. She looked at the document in his hands. She looked at Vivian standing to his right, watching her with an expression that had settled into something careful and still, the expression of a woman watching a thing she has engineered arrive at its conclusion and monitoring it for unexpected variables. She looked at the unfamiliar faces along the wall. She thought about Halverson, about the garrison records, about where Halverson's men were right now, and whether 23 familiar veterans were enough for what this moment actually required. She thought about Marin, who she had not seen in the corridors. She thought about the letter, the 8-spoke seal, the thing she had not yet found, the thing that connected all of it, the thing that would turn a pattern into a case capable of standing in this room against what was being said right now. She didn't have it. Cedric picked up the seal. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the wax touched the document, before the execution order became a legal instrument under the kingdom's founding charter, before 3 days became the only timeline that mattered. She thought, I have built things before on nothing. I have stood in rooms before where everything was against me. I have calculated from incomplete information and been right more often than I have been wrong, and I am still here, which is the only evidence that ever actually matters. She said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as she intended it to carry, and no further, wait. Cedric stopped. The room did not breathe. You're about to sign an order, she said, built on documents taken from my office without my knowledge, testimony extracted under duress from a man currently imprisoned in your dungeon, and charges prepared by the same administrative office that has been routing 60,000 crown out of your treasury for the last 22 months. The silence was total. She kept her eyes on Cedric, not on Vivienne, not on the strangers along the wall, on her husband, who was holding the seal above the wax, and who had gone very still. Check the seal, she said, the one on the execution order. Who prepared that document? Who brought it to this chamber? What house seal is on the courier bag that arrived in your ministerial office 2 nights ago? She paused. The wheel with 8 spokes. She watched his face. She watched the exact moment the name arrived in his memory. Because he was the king, and foreign intelligence briefings crossed his desk even when he didn't read them fully, even when he filed them without follow-up, and the 8-spoke wheel was a mark distinctive enough that it had been in at least 2 briefings she had personally flagged for his attention. She watched the recognition move through him, and she watched Vivian, in her peripheral vision, make a very small movement, barely a shift of weight, barely a change in posture, that told Serafina everything about who had the most to lose in the next 30 seconds. Cedric lowered the seal. He did not set it down. He did not let go of the document. He just lowered the seal to the table surface and held it there, and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read because it contained too many things at once, anger and confusion and the specific stricken quality of a proud man who is beginning to understand the shape of what he has been standing inside. What, he said, are you telling me? And from the doorway, the main council chamber doors, which she had come through under guard, which had been guarded by 2 of the unfamiliar faces since she arrived, came the sound of something she had not expected. Commotion, raised voices, and underneath it the specific sound of people moving in a coordinated way toward a defined objective. Every head in the room turned. Fisk was at the door. He had turned at the sound too, and his hand was on his weapon, and his face had the look of a man running very fast calculations in real time. The doors came open. Commander Bren Halverson walked in. He was in garrison uniform, no dress additions, the plain working kit of a man who had come from the field and not stopped to change. He was followed by 6 men, garrison soldiers, faces she recognized. 3 of them from the eastern post she had never seen reassigned on any of the paperwork she'd reviewed, which meant they were men Halverson had kept off the official list for exactly this contingency. He stopped in the center of the room. He did not look at her first. He looked at Cedric. Military to sovereign, direct, flat, the kind of look that stripped all the ceremony out of a room and left only the material facts. "Your Majesty," he said, "I need to inform you that 12 individuals currently occupying positions in the inner palace are not palace garrison personnel." He reached into his coat and produced a document, folded, sealed with his garrison command mark. "I also need to inform you that one of the unfamiliar individuals detained at the Eastern Corridor post was carrying correspondence that Your Majesty will want to read immediately." He held it out. "The correspondence is addressed to a party outside this kingdom. It is signed." The room did not move. Cedric looked at the document in Halverson's hand. He looked at Vivian, and Serafina watched Vivian Darcy, 24 years old, in garnet red, standing in the Queen's position, do something she had not done once in the 6 months Serafina had been watching her from a distance and the 2 days she had been watching from closer. She flinched. It was small, almost nothing. The involuntary, uncontrolled response of a person whose structure has just cracked and who does not yet know what to do about it. Almost nothing. But Serafina had spent 32 years reading rooms. She looked at Cedric. He was staring at Vivian with the particular expression of a man whose pride has just met something it cannot immediately process. Not anger yet, not grief, not the full comprehension of damage, but the first cold breath of a thing that was going to be all of those and could not be undone. He reached out. He took the document from Halverson's hand. He broke the seal. He read it. The room waited. What happened next moved through Cedric's face in sequence, and it was not a small sequence. It was the visible internal collapse of 6 months of certainty, of the particular certainty that had felt most like truth because it had required the least from him. She watched it and felt nothing she would have expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the dry recognition of a thing arriving at the moment it was always going to arrive, stripped of all the ceremony that had delayed it. He put the document down on the table. He put the execution order face down on top of it. He looked at Serafina. His jaw was working again. His face had the raw, exposed quality of a man who has been stripped of every defense simultaneously and has not yet had time to build new ones. "How long?" he said. His voice was rough, not loud. "How long have you known?" She looked at him. "I've been piecing it together since I heard the horses arrive," she said. "The treasury irregularities I flagged to you 3 months ago." He flinched, not as small as Vivian's flinch, larger, more honest. "I sent you a memo," she said. "Not cruel, just accurate. About House Varent, about the Eastern Confederacy's route manipulation. I sent you a memo, and I marked it for your attention, and you—" "I know what I did," he said. The room had the quality of a held breath. She thought about the execution order face down on the table. She thought about 3 days. She thought about Marin, who she still hadn't seen, and about the documents she still didn't have in hand, and about the 12 individuals currently in this palace who were not palace garrison. She thought about Halverson's 6 men at the door, and the 12 in the corridors, and what those numbers meant against each other. She thought about Aldrin in the cell below, who had either betrayed her or had had his name used to betray her, and about the fact that she still didn't know which. There was a version of this moment, she could see it clearly, in which she accepted what Halverson had just brought into the room and allowed it to be enough, in which Cedric read the letter and understood, and the order stayed face down, and the 12 men in the corridors were handled by the garrison, and the immediate crisis resolved. She could see that version. She could also see, with the same clarity, that resolving the immediate crisis left everything beneath it intact. The framework, the access that had been built, the channels that had been used, the people inside this palace who had looked like furniture. The letter Halverson had produced was one letter, from one intercepted courier. There were more. There had to be more. A 22-month operation of this scale did not run on a single correspondence channel. And if the people who built this understood, which they would within hours once the detained courier didn't report in, that the structure had been partially exposed, what happened next would not be a managed retreat. It would be what you do when you have soldiers inside a building and the exit starts closing. Serafina looked at Halverson. "Commander," she said, "the 12 individuals in the corridors. Where are they positioned?" Halverson read her face with the speed of a man who had been in enough bad situations to know when someone was ahead of him. 3 at the main stairs, he said. 2 at the king's corridor. 4 at the outer gates. 3 unaccounted for. 3 unaccounted for. She looked at Cedric, and she understood, in the specific way you understand a thing when the last piece arrives, and the picture is complete, and you cannot undo the fact of having seen it, that the 3 days on the execution order had never been about giving the kingdom time to prepare for a public sentence. 3 days was how long it took to move a full mercenary company from the Thornfield staging point to the capital. The 12 men tonight were not the force. They were the preparation for the force. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was steady. Everything she had, every year of management and calculation and carrying this institution on her back while someone else wore its crown, landed in those 2 words, not as plea and not as accusation, but as the only form of communication left that the moment could hold. "You need to make a decision right now, not in an hour, now." Cedric looked at her. He looked like a man standing on ice that has been cracking for 6 months, and has only now, in this specific second, heard the sound. "What decision?" he said. She looked at the document he held, the letter. She looked at the execution order face down beneath it. She looked at Vivian, who had gone absolutely still in the way of a person who has run out of moves and is waiting to see which way the board falls. "You can pick up that seal," she said, "and finish what you started. Or you can give it to me and we deal with what's actually happening to this kingdom." The room held. Nobody breathed. Cedric looked at the seal on the table, at the document in his hand, at the woman he had locked in a dungeon for refusing to perform gratitude, and at the woman he had placed beside him who had used that dungeon door as a cover for something that would have burned everything he had built to the ground. He picked up the seal. Serafina's hands were still. He looked at her for one long, stripped bare moment, and then he held the seal out to her across the table. She took it. It was cold, heavy. The king's seal, with its wheat and sword crest, fit exactly in her palm. She had handled it before, hundreds of times, in the course of ordinary administration. But the weight of it in this specific moment, taken from his hand in front of this specific room, was a different kind of weight than it had ever been before. She set it down on top of the execution order. She looked at Halverson. "Lock the corridors," she said. "Find the 3 unaccounted for before anything else. Nobody in or out of the main gates without garrison clearance." She looked at Fisk, who had been standing at the door through all of it, with his hand still on his weapon and his face carefully neutral. "Captain, I need the king's administrative records for the last 8 months. Every signed order, every minister countersignature, every foreign correspondence log. Tonight." Fisk looked at Cedric. Cedric nodded. One short, flat movement. The nod of a man who has given something up that he will not get back in the form he had it. "And Vivian Darcy," Serafina said. She made herself look at the woman directly, garnet red. Practiced modesty, all gone now. Just the face underneath, which was younger than it had looked and harder than it had looked, and was currently doing the calculation of someone who has lost the primary position and is assessing the secondary options. There were no secondary options. "Arrest her," Serafina said. "Gently. She has information we need, and she is more useful answering questions than she is in a cell." Halverson moved. 2 of his men moved with him. Vivian did not fight. She had the intelligence not to fight. She looked once at Cedric, a look that had in it something Serafina chose not to interpret too precisely, because she did not need to understand it. She only needed to manage what came next. And then she looked at the floor and she let Halverson's men take her arms. The council chamber was silent. 14 ministers sat at the long table, and every one of them was looking at Serafina, and none of them were looking at Cedric. And the weight of that, The specific institutional weight of a room that is just recalculated where its attention belongs, pressed against the walls like weather. She did not feel the thing she might have expected. Not triumph, not relief, not the satisfaction of a woman vindicated. What she felt was the weight of the next 12 hours, the 3 unaccounted men in the corridors, the Thornfield staging point and the company of soldiers she did not yet have the full count on, the letter, which was one letter, and the channels it had come through and what those channels still contained. She thought about what she knew and what she still didn't know, and the gap between them was still large enough to be dangerous, and the clock was not gone just because the execution order was face down on the table. She looked at the council. "We have work to do," she said. "All of us. Tonight." And from somewhere below, from the lower fortress, through 3 levels of stone, in the cold of a wet dungeon that smelled of river and old decisions, she heard, or thought she heard, the sound of a door being opened. Aldrin. Still down there. She thought about his face through the cell bars when the guards brought him in, the face of a man who had run out of road, and she thought about testimony given under duress, and testimony given by choice, and how you told the difference from the outside, and how much it mattered, and how little time she had left to find out which one it had been. The room was moving now. Guards, ministers, Halverson's men repositioning, and in the center of it she stood with the king's seal in her hand and the execution order face down on the table and 3 unaccounted mercenaries somewhere in the walls of this palace and a staging point full of soldiers 2 days' ride from the capital. 3 days. The order said 3 days. She thought, I have worked with less. She thought, it will have to be enough. And underneath both of those thoughts, very quiet, in the specific place where she kept the things she didn't let herself examine for too long because examining them cost time she couldn't spare, she thought about the seal in her hand and the room that had just turned to look at her instead of him, and she thought that there were some doors you walked through only once, and that once you were through them, the room you had come from was not a room you could return to. She set the seal on the table. She looked at Cedric. He was watching her with the stripped, careful face of a man who has just understood, fully and without possibility of revision, what he had standing beside him for 6 years and what he had done with it. She did not say anything to him. Not yet. There would be time for that. Or there wouldn't. But either way, it was not the next thing. The next thing was the palace corridors and the 3 missing men and the staging point and the letter and the full account of what had been built and by whom and how deep it went. The next thing was always the work. It had always been the work. She turned to Halverson. "Show me the letter," she said. The letter was written in cipher. Not a complex one, but trade cipher, the kind the Eastern Confederacy used for commercial correspondence to give the appearance of proprietary sensitivity without the overhead of actual diplomatic encryption. She had seen it twice in intelligence briefings, had asked the kingdom's correspondence office to build a key 3 years ago as a precaution, and had then watched the request sit unactioned for 8 months before she did it herself. The key was in her office, which was currently 3 floors above her and potentially occupied by people she didn't know. "I can read it," she said. Halverson looked at her. "The cipher," she said. "Give me something to write on." Someone produced paper. A council clerk, young, moving fast with the instinct of a person who had identified the new operational center of the room and was positioning accordingly. She took the paper and a pen, and she worked through the letter standing at the council table with Halverson at her shoulder and 14 ministers in various states of controlled panic arranged around her. And she broke it in 11 minutes because the key was not complex. It was just systematic, and systematic things yielded to patience and method. What came out was worse than she had expected. Not in its existence, she had known the framework, had built the shape of it from fragments over 2 days in a wet cell. But in its specificity, the letter was operational. It was a confirmation of timing, written in the flat, functional language of people transacting a completed arrangement, the council proceeding on schedule, the garrison reassignments complete, the package secured pending transfer, final payment upon delivery of the instrument. The instrument. She read that word twice. In trade cipher, instrument had a standard meaning. It referred to a document, a contract, a deed, a legal transfer. In the context of the rest of the letter, the context of a palace council proceeding and a package secured and payment pending, the instrument was the signed execution order. The execution order was not the end of the operation. It was the delivery mechanism. Once signed and sealed under the kingdom's founding charter, the execution order for a reigning queen became the most significant legal document the kingdom could produce. It represented the full institutional authority of crown and council, authenticated beyond challenge. In the hands of the right parties, it was not just a death sentence. It was a proof of sovereignty in crisis, a document that, presented to the right foreign court or trade authority alongside the chaos of a capital seizure, could be used to argue that the existing government had collapsed and that a successor claim had legal standing. She set the pen down. She looked at Halverson. "They weren't going to kill me," she said. "They were going to use the order to argue the kingdom's administration had failed, present it to the Confederacy courts as evidence of internal collapse, and invoke the trade emergency clauses to place the river routes under Confederacy oversight." She paused. "Permanently." Halverson's face did something controlled and very unfriendly. "House Varent gets the Western Territories under Confederacy protection," she said. "The Confederacy gets the river routes, and whoever has been running this," she looked at the letter, "gets paid." She looked at Vivian, who was seated now, flanked by two of Halverson's men, and who had been listening to this with the expression of a woman watching a building she had spent considerable time constructing get taken apart brick by brick with professional efficiency. Not broken, not crying, just watching, with the careful attention of someone assessing damage and deciding what position to take next. "How far up does it go?" Serafina said. Vivian looked at her. "I was told what I needed to know," she said. Her voice was flat. Not defiant, just factual. The voice of a woman who had long since stopped performing anything for anyone in this room. "I was a placement. You know that already." "Who placed you?" A pause. "A man called Aldrich Varent," Vivian said. "He is the second son of the house, not the Lord. The Lord doesn't know, or didn't when I was deployed." She looked at her own hands. "He had a plan, and he needed access, and I was access." "What did he promise you?" Vivian's jaw moved, the first real crack in the surface. "A title," she said. "Land, the western estate that was mortgaged." She looked up, and her eyes were very clear and very hard. "It doesn't matter now." "No," Serafina agreed. "It doesn't." She turned back to Halverson. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead of the room, running the next sequence, building forward from what she had into what needed to happen. "The staging point," she said. "Thornfield, how many men and how long?" "Best estimate from the courier's documents, 50 to 80. 2 days hard ride." He paused. "Could be closer if they push through the night on signal." "What signal?" "We don't know." She thought about the 3 unaccounted men. "Find them," she said. "Now, before anything else." Halverson turned to 2 of his garrison soldiers and gave the order in the clipped, exact language of men who have trained for this kind of instruction. They moved. She turned to the council. 14 ministers. She scanned faces with the speed of long practice. Who was with her? Who was calculating? Who was genuinely confused about what had just happened versus who was confused because they were deciding whether to be? She had worked alongside these men for 6 years. She knew their tells. 3 of the 4 unfamiliar faces had been removed with Halverson's men. The 4th was still seated along the wall. He had the posture of a man trying to be unobtrusive, which was itself conspicuous. She looked at Fisk. Fisk moved to the 4th man with the economy of motion that was his most consistent quality. The man came out of his chair without being asked. That told her he was experienced enough to know when a room had closed. She looked at Cedric. He had not moved from his position at the head of the table. He was still standing, had not sat, which she read as a man who did not trust himself to perform seated authority right now. He was watching her run his council chamber, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has handed something over and is still adjusting to the loss of the weight. She needed him functional, not recovered. There was no recovering from this in a night, but functional, operational. A king who was visibly collapsed was a worse problem right now than a king who was bruised and upright. Cedric, she said. He looked at her. The use of his given name in this room, at this moment, had a different register than it had had at any point in 6 years. Not warmer, more direct. The register of two people on the same side of an emergency who did not have time for anything except the emergency. I need you to issue 3 orders, she said, right now, through Fisk, so there's no question of the chain of command. She looked at Fisk. First, full garrison mobilization, all eastern approach roads sealed. Second, a rider to Lord Harwick tonight, not tomorrow, tonight, requesting his return to the capital. She looked back at Cedric. Third, a courier to the northern garrison at Aldenvale invoking the Mutual Defense Protocol. You remember what that protocol is? His jaw worked. I signed it 4 years ago, he said. You did. I drafted it. She held his eyes. It was designed for exactly this. It gives us 200 northern cavalry within 36 hours if we invoke now. He looked at the table for a moment, at the execution order still face down under the king's seal, at the letter she had decoded in 11 minutes sitting at his council table. All right, he said. Not performance. Not the theatrical authority of a king performing decisiveness. Just a word, flat and real, from a man who had lost the luxury of his pride in the last hour and was discovering what remained underneath it. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her in 3 years. She turned back to the work. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated, sustained operational effort she had managed since the border crisis of her 3rd year, but that had been managed from a desk with staff and correspondence channels, and the full apparatus of the Queen's administrative office. This was managed from a council chamber with a borrowed pen, and the garrison captain she trusted most, and a king who was still finding his footing in the new shape of the room. She sent the riders. She reviewed the garrison deployment with Halverson, looking at the map he'd had brought up from the command post. The kingdom's territory laid out in ink on vellum, the eastern approach roads marked, the Thornfield Pass circled in her own handwriting from a briefing 3 months ago. She looked at the distance and the time and the rate at which 50 to 80 soldiers could move through mountain terrain in early winter, and she calculated. They had a window. It was not comfortable, and it was not certain, but it existed. Fisk came back from the search at the 2nd hour. 2 found, he said. He had the look of a man who had found them in a way he was being concise about. The 3rd, he stopped. She waited. The 3rd was in the correspondence sorting hall, he said. Corvin? She asked the question with her eyes. The clerk is alive, Fisk said immediately. Shaken. He was locked in a supply closet. He's been retrieved. She absorbed that. The specific texture of relief that came not from sentiment, but from the recognition that an asset was intact, combined with the colder understanding of what the 3rd man had been doing in the correspondence hall, what he had been looking for, or destroying, or intercepting. What did he take? She said. We don't know yet. Corvin says the man went through the incoming dispatch bin. Tonight's arrival's not yet processed. Tonight's arrivals, she looked at Halverson. Whatever came in tonight through official channels, someone didn't want us to see it, she said, which means someone knew to look for it, which means there's a channel we haven't identified yet. Inside the palace, Halverson said. Inside the palace. The window they had was real, but it had a hole in it she couldn't see clearly. She pushed that to the side and kept moving. At the 3rd hour, Marin arrived. She appeared at the council chamber door with 2 garrison soldiers who had found her. Where she had been for the last 6 hours, it turned out, was in the sub-level archive room, the one that required a specific key that only 3 people in the palace held, working by lantern light through the document boxes that predated Serafina's tenure. She was carrying a cloth satchel that she held against her body with the careful grip of a woman transporting something fragile. She set it on the council table. Darcy household registration documents, complete set, she said. Her voice was steady, though she had the eyes of someone running on her last reserves. Foreign correspondence logs for the last 14 months, Minister of Interior's office, and the original charter of House Varent's Western Land Claim, the one they filed 18 years ago and lost. She looked at Serafina. And the amended version they filed 6 months ago, which no one countersigned, and which, as far as I can tell, no one in the current administration knew existed. Serafina pulled the amended charter from the satchel. She read it in 2 minutes, felt the specific cold clarity of understanding a plan's full architecture when the last document arrives. The amended claim had been drafted to be activated in the wake of a sovereignty challenge. It was written to slide into the legal vacuum that would have been created by the execution order, the Confederacy's emergency trade clauses, and the chaos of a capital seizure happening simultaneously. It was thorough. It was patient. It had been built over 18 years with the long-game precision of a house that had lost through courts and was determined not to lose again. She looked at Vivian. "Aldrich Verent," she said. "Where is he now?" Vivian looked at the table. "He arrived with the riders tonight," she said. The room went very still. Serafina looked at Halverson. Halverson looked back at her with the expression of a man recalculating rapidly. "The 12 we identified," he said. "We have 9 secured. 3 were the unaccounted. 2 secured," she said. "1 in the correspondence hall. 9 and 2, he said. 11. 12 were in the palace, she said. 1 is Aldrich Verent. 1 man unaccounted for. In a palace with sealed corridors and garrison mobilization, and a king who had just switched sides. But also with walls she didn't know all the passages of, with staff she hadn't fully audited, with 18 years of patience behind the man who had built this, and who was somewhere in the building right now understanding, as clearly as she had understood it when she heard the horses arrive, exactly how the structure had changed. Halverson was already at the door issuing orders. She was already moving, and the question that accompanied her movement, the question that every hour of the last 4 hours had been building toward without quite arriving at, was, where does a man go when his plan collapses? When the building is locked? When the exits are guarded and the instrument he needed is no longer available? She thought about the correspondence hall. The third man. What he had been looking for in the dispatch bin. She thought about what would come in through official channels tonight that someone would need to intercept. And then she understood. She turned to the clerk who had been standing at the edge of the room, still there, still useful, with the particular stamina of a young man who has decided to see something through to its end. "The dispatch bin," she said. "Tonight's arrivals. What comes in through the official diplomatic channel at this hour?" He blinked, thought. "Overnight diplomatic posts from the border outposts. Standard protocol, sealed for morning review." "From which outpost?" "Rotating schedule." He reached for the schedule sheet on the side table. The administrative detail of a working palace, maintained automatically, regardless of everything else. He scanned it. "Tonight it's the Eastern Post. Aldenvale Outpost." Aldenvale. The outpost she had sent a rider to an hour ago. The northern garrison she had invoked the mutual defense protocol with. The protocol that, once invoked, required a confirmation dispatch to be sent back through official channels within 2 hours. A confirmation dispatch that, if intercepted, would tell whoever held it that 200 Northern cavalry were on their way, and would give the Thornfield staging point exactly enough information to move now rather than waiting for the 3-day timeline, to push through the night at speed and arrive before any reinforcement could reach the capital. She was already at the door. "Halverson," she said, and her voice came out flat and hard. "The Eastern Wing. The diplomatic receipt office. Now!" He was beside her. They moved into the corridor together. The palace at this hour was a strange thing. Half locked-down military deployment, half the ordinary nighttime quiet of a large building settling into itself. And the contrast between those two states created pockets of uncertainty in the corridors, places where the garrison mobilization hadn't fully reached, where the normal evening routine still operated on momentum. The diplomatic receipt office was in the Eastern Wing, 2nd floor. A small room staffed by a single overnight clerk whose job was to receive, log, and store diplomatic dispatches until the morning administrative review. It was not a secure room in any serious sense. It had a door with a standard bolt and a window that opened onto the eastern courtyard. The window was open when they arrived. The overnight clerk was on the floor. Alive. She checked before anything else, crouching at his side. Alive, breathing, with the beginning of a bruise at his temple from something fast and blunt. His dispatch log was on the desk, and the Aldenvale confirmation pouch was gone. She stood up. She looked at the open window, at the courtyard below, lit by 2 garrison torches, because Halverson had mobilized, but with gaps between them that the dark filled. At the eastern wall, beyond the courtyard, where the gate that led to the city was. The Eastern Gate. The gate from which 23 experienced veterans had been reassigned over 4 months, replaced by men now either secured or accounted for. But the gate itself. "What's the gate status?" she said. Halverson was at the window. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a sharp whistle. Garrison signal. Something with specific meaning she didn't know the code for, but read from the immediate response. A shout from the courtyard below, voices in motion. "Garrison confirmed on the gate," he said. But his voice had the quality of a man not fully confident in what he was confirming. She looked at the courtyard. A figure was moving across it. Not running. Not yet. Moving at the deliberate, controlled pace of a man who has not yet been seen and is keeping it that way. Moving toward the eastern gate with something under his coat and the specific directional intent of someone with a destination and a use for what he was carrying. Aldrich Varent was 40 yards from the gate. She had seen him once, in person, 3 years ago, at a trade arbitration hearing. She recognized the build. Tall, lean, the kind of lean that came from discipline rather than deprivation. He had a scholar's face and a soldier's movement, and she had noted him then as someone whose intelligence was operating at a different level than most of the people in the room, and she had written it in her notes, and it had ended up in the briefing she sent Cedric. The briefing Cedric hadn't read. Halverson was already over the windowsill. She heard him hit the courtyard below. A controlled drop, soldiers landing, and heard him shout. Varent ran. She moved. Not through the window. She was in a court gown, and that was a 14-foot drop, and she was not 25. She moved through the corridor, through the turn at the east junction, down the service stair that came out into the courtyard's south entrance, the one that was closer to the gate than the window was. She burst through the door into the cold night air. The courtyard was alive. Garrison soldiers responding to Halverson's signal, converging on the eastern side. Torchlight swinging, voices sharp and directive. She ran, actually ran, sage green dress be damned, her court shoes on the cobbles finding grip where they could and sliding where they couldn't, and she felt her lungs register the cold, and her knees register the dungeon, and she pushed through both of them because this was the thing she could not let out of the building. Not Varent himself. She had enough on Varent. Vivian's testimony, the documents, the intercepted letter. He was already finished as a legal matter, but the confirmation dispatch in his coat. If he got it over the wall and signaled the Thornfield staging point tonight, the Northern Cavalry were still a day and a half out. 50 to 80 soldiers moving through the night could be at the Capitol Gate by dawn. Halverson was faster than she was. He had the legs for it, and no dress impeding them. She watched him cut the angle on Varent, watched Varent adjust his trajectory toward the gate itself. 15 yards, 10. Watched the gate guards turn and register the situation and start to move. Varent hit the first gate guard with his shoulder at full speed. The guard went sideways, not down, but off balance, and out of the line. Varent had his hand on the gate bar. Halverson tackled him from the left. They went into the gate together, the sound of it, 2 men at full speed into iron-reinforced wood, filling the courtyard with a crack that echoed off the walls. Halverson's hands were on Varent's coat. Varent was fighting. Not panicked, not desperate, controlled and efficient, the fighting of a man who is prepared for physical contingencies. He got an elbow into Halverson's jaw. Halverson's grip loosened for a second. She was there. She did not have Halverson's size or his training. What she had was proximity and the specific, targeted clarity of a woman who had spent 4 hours understanding exactly what was in that coat and what it would cost if it left this courtyard. She grabbed the coat with both hands. Varent turned on her, and she saw his face up close for the first time. Not the composed intelligence of the trade arbitration, but the stripped-back face of a man whose plan has collapsed, and who is running on the instinct of someone who has spent 18 years building toward something and is watching it disappear in real time. There was nothing theatrical in his expression, just the raw calculation of how much she was in the way and what it would take to move her. She held on. Halverson recovered. He got his arms around Varent from behind. A proper restraint, the kind that required the other person to fight physics rather than just training. And Varent went down to one knee on the cobblestones, and she felt his grip on the coat shift, and she reached inside and pulled. The dispatch pouch came out. She stepped back. Her lungs were burning and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she registered distantly, just from the specific physiological aftermath of adrenaline meeting a body that had been running on minimal food and no sleep for 2 days. She stood in the torchlit courtyard with the Alden Vale confirmation pouch in her hands, and she breathed. Halverson had Varent secured. 2 garrison soldiers arrived at speed and took over. Varent was on his knees on the cobblestones, controlled, not fighting anymore. The calculation complete, the conclusion reached, the specific stillness of a man who has arrived at the terminal point of something he built a long time and has nothing left to spend on resistance. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You came close," she said. She was not being theatrical, it was simply accurate. He looked at the pouch in her hands, at the gate he hadn't gotten through, at the courtyard that was now full of garrison soldiers, at a mobilization she had ordered 2 hours ago. "You were in a dungeon 2 days ago," he said. His voice was even, the voice of a man capable of appreciating the specific shape of a thing, even when it was the thing that had destroyed him. "I was," she said. He was quiet. "The plan was sound," he said. Not to her, not to anyone in particular. Just the flat acknowledgement of a craftsman looking at his own work and accounting for where it had failed. "Yes," she said, "it was. For most of the people it was designed for." She looked at him. "You miscalculated what I would do with 7 days in a cell." He said nothing. "Most people," she said, "would have spent those days waiting to be rescued, or trying to escape, or falling apart." She felt the cold of the courtyard on her bare shoulders, the cobblestones through the thin soles of her court shoes, the specific exhaustion of a body that had been asked to do more than it had been given resources for. "I have been building things in bad conditions since I was 19. You needed me to be someone different." She turned to the garrison soldiers. "Take him to the council chamber," she said. "Not the lower fortress. I want him where I can ask him questions." She looked at Halverson, who was standing with the controlled, flat expression of a man who had just hit a gate at full speed and was not going to mention it. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said. "You're bleeding." "It's minimal." She handed him the dispatch pouch and turned back toward the palace. The eastern courtyard behind her was full of torchlight and garrison voices and the specific organized chaos of a mobilization finding its shape, and she walked through it with sage-green silk dragging on the cobblestones and her hair half down from the run and the specific sensation in her chest that was not triumph. She would not call it triumph. She had no room for it and no use for it, but was the thing that came after you have done everything you could do with what you had, and the thing has held. For now. For this hour. There was still the Thornfield staging point, still 50 to 80 soldiers who would be expecting a signal that wasn't coming, and who would, by morning, understand that the signal wasn't coming, and who would then do one of 2 things: disperse, which was best, or advance on their own initiative, which was the scenario she was still building against. The Northern cavalry were 36 hours out. She had ordered the eastern approaches sealed. She had the dispatch pouch. She had Varent. She did not yet know if it would be enough. She walked back into the palace and up the stairs and into the corridor that led to the council chamber. And as she turned the corner, she nearly walked into Corvin, young Corvin from the correspondence hall, who someone had apparently put a blanket around and who was standing in the corridor outside the council chamber with the expression of a man who has been locked in a supply closet and has decided that the appropriate response to that is to immediately go back to work. He had a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Your Majesty," he said. Before the man came for the dispatch bin, I'd already processed part of tonight's arrivals. He held out the papers. "There's a letter from Lord Harwick." She stopped. "He sent it this afternoon," Corvin said. "Before the rider, you sent him tonight." He paused. "He was already coming back." She took the letter. She read it standing in the corridor. Harwick had not gone home after being stripped. He had ridden to the outer city and convened, within 2 hours of leaving the palace, an informal assembly of 6 senior lords who maintained residences within a half-day's ride. He had told them what had happened. He had told them what he believed it meant. And he had written to her, not to Cedric, to her, asking for a formal request for council convening under the kingdom's charter, which required 12 lords' signatures and which, once filed, the king could not legally dismiss. He had 9 signatures already. He needed 3 more. She looked up from the letter. She looked at Corvin. "How fast can a rider reach Harwick tonight?" she said. "An hour each way," he said. "Maybe less." She folded the letter. She thought about the council chamber behind that door, with Cedric and the ministers and Vivian and Verent, and the Thornfield staging point, and the Northern cavalry, and the sealed roads, and the dispatch pouch, and 6 years of this palace on her back, and 2 days in a cell, and the king's seal cold in her palm. She thought about what Harwick's letter meant if she moved on it tonight. Not just an emergency session, not just an investigation. A formal council convening under the charter was the one mechanism in the kingdom's founding documents that operated independently of royal authority. It had been invoked twice in the kingdom's history, both times to address constitutional crises. It could not be dismissed. It could not be sealed. It did not require the king's signature on anything. It required only 12 lords. Harwick had 9. She looked at Corvin. "Get me a rider," she said. "The fastest one in the garrison stable. And a pen." He moved. She stood in the corridor and she thought about what she was about to do. Not the riding order, not the logistics, but the thing beneath it, the weight of it. She had spent 6 years working inside the structure she had been handed, working around its failures, carrying what it could not carry, managing what it refused to manage. That had been the calculation she had always made, that the structure was worth preserving even when the person at its head was not, that the institution was larger than the man, and that her job was to protect the institution. She still believed that. What she was revising was the definition of protection. Protection was not the same as deference. Protection was not absorbing damage indefinitely and trusting that the structure would eventually self-correct. Protection was sometimes removing the point of failure before it brought the whole thing down. She had 9 signatures. She needed 3. The pen arrived. She pressed it against the wall. No desk, no table, just the stone wall of the palace corridor. And she wrote. She wrote quickly, with the directness of someone who does not have time for ceremony, and what she wrote was not a request. It was a specific formal invocation of the council charter, with her name and her position and the grounds, treasury fraud, foreign infiltration, sedition, and the endangerment of the kingdom's sovereign integrity, stated in the plain legal language of the founding documents. The grounds that she had, the evidence that she now held. She sealed it with the only seal she had on her person, which was not the Queen's seal, and was not the King's seal, but was the administrative seal of the Royal Chancellor's office, a position that did not currently exist, that had not existed for 60 years, but that was still technically inscribed in the Charter as a constitutional role with legal standing. She looked at what she had written. She thought, "This is a door." She thought, "Once I send this, the room on the other side of it is not a room I have been in before." She handed it to Corvin. "To Harwick," she said. "Now." He was gone. She stood in the corridor alone for one moment, just one, the specific length of a breath held and released, and then she turned and pushed open the council chamber door and walked back in. The room looked at her. Cedric looked at her. She looked at the execution order still face down on the table, and at the king's seal beside it, and at the 14 ministers, and at Vivian in her chair, and at Verent, who had been brought in and was seated against the far wall with 2 garrison soldiers. She thought about the 9 signatures and the 3 she needed, and the rider now in the stable yard saddling up for Harwick. She thought about 36 hours in the northern road and 50 soldiers who were waiting for a signal she now held in a pouch. She thought about the charter, about the position she had just invoked that had not existed for 60 years. She looked at Cedric. His face had the quality it had had in the courtyard. Stripped, functional, bruised in the way of a man who has given something up. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who understands they are watching a decision being made that concerns them entirely, but that is no longer theirs to make. She said, "There is going to be a formal council convening under the charter." He was quiet. "I have grounds," she said. "I have evidence, and I have—" She paused. "I have 9 signatures." He looked at her for a long time. "You need 12, he said. "Yes." He looked at the table, at the execution order, at everything that had accumulated on the surface in front of him over the course of this night, and then he reached into the inner pocket of his formal coat and produced the small personal seal he carried there. Not the king's great seal, but the personal mark, the one that had his name on it and not just his title, the one that was a man's signature rather than a crown's authority. He set it on the table. She looked at it. "That's 10, he said. She did not let her face do anything with that. She picked up the pen. She had 2 more to find before Harwick's rider came back. She had the evidence on the table, Varent in the chair, the dispatch pouch secured, and the Eastern Road sealed and the Northern Cavalry en route, and a letter already riding into the night. She had 2 more signatures in 36 hours, and everything she had built in the dark of a wet cell for 2 days, held together with a borrowed scarf and a kitchen girl's courage, and the specific, unbroken instinct of a woman who had been told repeatedly and in various forms that she was done. She was not done. She looked at Minister Aldrin's empty seat. She looked at the 14 men at the table. She looked at the pen in her hand. And from somewhere below the palace, from the direction of the lower fortress, through 3 levels of stone, she heard the sound of the guard station door opening. And she thought, Aldrin. The question she had not answered. The question she had been running alongside for 2 days without resolution. Testimony given under duress, or testimony given by choice? The sound of footsteps on the lower stairs. The council chamber door opened, and Seraphina Ashcroft, standing at the head of the king's table with a pen in her hand, and 2 signatures still needed and everything balancing on the edge of a night that was not yet done, looked up. It was Aldrin. He walked through the council chamber door under his own power, which told her the first thing she needed to know. No guards at his elbows, no restraint, no the managed movement of a man being delivered somewhere. He walked in the way a man walks when he has made a decision and has come to account for it. He looked terrible. 2 days in the lower fortress had taken the minister's careful presentation. The pressed dark coat, the precise grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of institutional authority, and reduced it to something raw. His coat was wrinkled and damp at the shoulders. His face had the gray, heavy quality of a man who had not slept, and who had spent the sleepless hours doing something harder than sleep. He stopped when he saw the room, saw Varent against the wall, saw Vivian in her chair, saw Cedric standing at the head of the table. Then he looked at Seraphina. She looked back at him. She had been carrying the question for 2 days. Testimony given under duress, or testimony given by choice. She had not allowed herself to resolve it because she did not have the evidence, and resolving it without evidence was the kind of thinking that got people killed when they were wrong. She read his face now. Not a full answer. Faces weren't confessions. But enough. The specific expression of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has arrived finally at the place where he has to stand next to it. "Sit down, Aldrin," she said. He sat. At the table. Not against the wall. That was its own kind of statement, and she let it stand. She looked at the room. "We are going to go through this in order," she said. "From the beginning. Everything that was done, by whom, through which channels, and on whose authority. Varent first, then the ministers who countersigned orders they should not have countersigned." She looked at Aldrin. "And then the question of what testimony was given to this council tonight, and how." She pulled out a chair. She sat down. Not at the Queen's position, at the center of the table where the work was, where the documents were spread and the decoded letters sat and the charter lay open to the mutual defense protocol. She folded her hands. "Aldrich Varent," she said, "you have 2 choices. You give me a full account, voluntarily, tonight, and that cooperation is recorded and considered by the formal council when it convenes. Or I build the account from the documents I already have, and your cooperation is not recorded anywhere." She paused. "The evidence is sufficient either way. What cooperation buys you is the difference between a charge of sedition and a charge of high treason." Varent looked at her from across the room. He was not a small man in any sense. Even seated against the wall with garrison soldiers at his sides, he had the quality of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given situation. He had spent 18 years building toward something with the patience and precision of a craftsman. He was looking at her now with the expression of that craftsman examining where the structure had failed, not with anger, because anger was for people who had not planned, and he had planned, but with the exact unhurried attention of a man taking the measure of what had beaten him. "You were in a dungeon," he said, for the second time tonight, still not rhetorical, still a genuine accounting. "Yes," she said, "and in 2 days you—" He stopped, made a small movement with his hands that was not quite a gesture, more the physical residue of a thought completing. "The garrison records. You had a protocol set up. 4 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "House Varent has been fighting for those land rights for 18 years, he said. Not as justification, as context. The difference mattered, and she read it as such. My father lost through courts he believed were corrupted. The evidence he had was real. The outcome was predetermined. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know. I reviewed the original arbitration records in my second year, she said. The procedural irregularities were visible. I flagged them internally. She held his eyes. I was preparing a formal review. The room was very quiet. You were preparing a review, he said. Which was then deprioritized because of the border crisis in year 3, she said. And then requeued. And then, she paused. She would not perform this, would not dress it in sentiment it hadn't earned. And then it was still in the queue. He looked at the table. He looked like a man who has just been handed a specific and particular form of devastation. Not the devastation of defeat, but the devastation of learning that what he had spent 18 years doing might have been unnecessary. That the system he had determined was too corrupted to engage might have, in a different circumstance, engaged correctly. There was nothing she could say about that. It was true, and it was terrible, and the time for it having mattered differently had passed. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning, he told her. It took 2 hours. It was thorough and it was precise, and it confirmed most of what she had built from fragments and filled in the parts she hadn't reached. The treasury channels, the Confederacy contacts, the arrangement with Vivian, the staged approach, the timing built around watching Cedric's pride for the right occasion and finding one. 22 months of patient, structural work designed by a man who was genuinely intelligent and genuinely wronged and who had let those two things combine into something that had required, at its final stage, foreign soldiers and a forged testimony and the death of a queen. When he was done, the room was very still. She wrote for a while after he finished. She had been writing throughout, not transcribing, she did not have a clerk for that, but noting the structural elements, the names, the dates, the confirmation points that matched her own documentation. When she set the pen down, her hand was cramped and the candles had burned down significantly. She looked at Aldrin. He had been sitting at the table throughout, and he had listened to Varent's account with the face of a man sitting through his own sentencing. She had watched him across the table while she worked, and she had read his face the way she read everything, for structure, for what was load-bearing, and she had arrived at her answer without asking. It wasn't duress, she said. He did not deny it. They came to you, she said. Not a question. 3 weeks ago, he said. His voice was low. Before I'd even processed everything I'd found. They told me they already knew I had been looking. They told me... He stopped. He put his hands flat on the table, and she looked at them. The hands of a man in his late 50s, a minister's hands, not a soldier's, and they were not entirely steady. They told me that if I gave a statement, they would ensure my daughter's household was not affected. She has children. She lives in the Eastern District. He looked at the table. I gave a statement. You gave a statement confirming I had authorized the foreign correspondence. Yes. She looked at him. She thought about what it cost a man to say that in a room. Not the legal cost, the other kind. The kind that lives in the space between who you believed you were and what you did when the test arrived. She had seen men fail that test in various ways over 32 years. She had learned not to be surprised by it, but she had also learned not to pretend the cost of it was small. Was your daughter contacted? She said. He looked up. No, he said. I don't believe they ever intended to. I believe it was said to produce exactly what it produced. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, not performing the quiet, just allowing herself the actual moment of it, the specific weight of sitting across from a man who had been her minister for 6 years and who had broken under pressure that had been applied with professional precision and who was now sitting with the result. She thought about what she believed about people and failure, about the fact that the same person could be reliable and unreliable, could serve well for years and break in a specific moment, could do damage and also still be the person who had done the years of good work. She thought about how systems that could only function with perfect people were not systems, they were fantasies. And she thought about what it meant to build something that could survive the real versions. "Your testimony is withdrawn," she said, "as coerced. That will be recorded." She looked at him directly. "What you did will also be recorded. Both things will exist in the same document because that is what is accurate." He nodded. She saw something in his face shift. Not relief, not absolution, but the specific settling of a man who has been given the thing he did not ask for, which is an honest accounting rather than a merciful one. "I'll require your full cooperation with the council review," she said. "You have it," he said, without hesitation. She looked at the room. It was past midnight. The council chamber had been in continuous session for 6 hours. The ministers looked like what they were. Men who had come to a formal proceeding expecting to ratify an execution order, and had spent the subsequent hours watching the architecture of their assumptions come apart and be rebuilt in a different configuration. Some of them had participated actively. Some had sat and watched. 2 had asked questions. One had said almost nothing and had the look of a man doing very careful internal accounting. She would deal with that one separately. She looked at Cedric. He had sat down, finally, at some point in the second hour. He was at the head of the table, and he had the look of a man who has been awake for a long time and has stopped trying to manage his appearance. His formal court dress had the crumpled quality of clothing that was built for ceremony and was now doing something else. He had been listening to Varent's account with his hands clasped on the table in front of him, and he had not interrupted and he had not looked away. She gave him that, the not looking away. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing she had seen him do in 3 years. "The Thornfield staging point," she said to Halverson, who had come back inside after securing Varent and who was standing at the door with his jaw showing the beginning of a bruise from the gate. "We need a rider out before dawn, a formal disbandment order, issued under the Crown's authority, with garrison escort to confirm. If they see a legitimate Crown order and a garrison presence, they'll stand down. They're mercenaries, not ideologues, and their contract is functionally void." Halverson nodded. "The Northern Cavalry can turn back once the disbandment is confirmed," she said. "No need to bring them all the way in." She paused. "Thank Aldenvale for the speed of their response. That gets recorded too." Halverson left to arrange it. She looked at the documents on the table, at the decoded letter, at the amended Varent charter, at the Darcy household papers and the correspondence logs and everything Marin had produced from the sub-level archive room. She thought about what had to be done with all of it. The formal council proceedings, the legal charges, the Confederacy diplomatic response, the House Varent land claim that was going to require an actual review now and not just a recued intention. She thought about the amount of work standing between tonight and a functioning resolution and felt the specific weight of it settle across her shoulders like something familiar. She thought, "This is what I do. This has always been what I do." The difference was that now it would have her name on it. She looked at Cedric. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Alone." The ministers filed out. The garrison soldiers remained at the door with the prisoners. Fisk, reading the room with his professional accuracy, positioned himself outside in the corridor where he could hear the door without being in the room. Cedric looked at her across the empty table. She looked at him. She was very tired. Not the theatrical exhaustion of someone who wanted the tiredness acknowledged, but the real kind. Bone deep, the kind that came from 2 days without sleep and a dungeon floor and the sustained operational intensity of the last 6 hours. She let herself feel it fully for the first time because she was in a room with only one other person and she could afford that small honesty. "Say what you need to say," Cedric said. She looked at him for a moment, at the man she had sat beside for 6 years, at the man who had, In his pride and his blindness, and his genuine incapacity for recognizing what he had standing next to him nearly burned everything they'd built to the ground. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had, in the long hours of the lower fortress, composed several versions of this conversation in her head. In some of them she was measured. In some she was precise. In one, the one she'd composed around the 3rd hour of the first night, when the cold was worst and the anger was cleanest, she was neither. She chose something between all of them. "You asked me once," she said, "in the 2nd year. Do you remember? You asked me why I never asked for anything." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. "We were reviewing the Eastern trade terms," she said. "You'd just signed off on an amendment I'd drafted, and you looked at me and you said, I remember exactly. You said, you could have asked for something in return for this. Everyone asks for something. Why don't you?" She paused. "I told you I didn't need anything, that I was doing my job." "I remember," he said. His voice was rough. "I lied," she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. "I needed to be seen. I needed what I built to be seen as built, not as something that existed because you allowed it, as something I made, with specific skills and specific decisions that could be named and accounted for." She looked at the table. "I needed that for 6 years, and I never asked for it because I understood correctly that asking for it from you would not produce it. Respect isn't a thing you can hand someone on request." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "I'm not telling you this for an apology," she said. "I'm telling you because you're going to govern this kingdom after tonight, and I need you to understand something structural about what went wrong. It wasn't Vivian. It wasn't Varant. Those were vectors. The actual vulnerability was the gap between what this administration was and what it was understood to be." She looked at him. "That gap is where they found the room to operate. You can close it, but only if you understand what created it." He looked at the table for a long time. "I'm going to ask you to come back," he said. She had expected it. She had thought about how to answer it. "No," she said. He looked up. "Not as queen," she said. "I won't come back as your queen." She said it without anger, without the performance of either grief or relief, just the clean fact of it. "That is not the position that will let me do what this kingdom needs, and—" She paused. She allowed herself this one thing, this one small private truth, in this room with only him. "And it is not the position I can hold after this, not because of the dungeon, because of the 6 years before the dungeon." Thoughts he did not argue. She gave him that too. "The charter has a provision," she said, "for a royal chancellor, an independent administrative authority, separate from the crown, accountable to the formal council. It hasn't been used in 60 years. She held his eyes. "I want it reinstated, with full authority over treasury oversight, foreign relations review, and ministerial accountability." He was quiet for a long time. "You'd be more powerful than me," he said. "I'd have different power than you," she said. "You would retain full executive authority, military command, final treaty ratification, judicial appointment. What I would have is oversight and accountability function, the thing that has been missing." She paused. "The thing that was missing when I was queen too, because I was running it informally without institutional protection, and the moment you chose to remove me, it disappeared overnight." He understood the point. She saw him understand it. The recognition that what she was describing was not just a promotion, but a structural fix to the precise vulnerability that had been exploited. "And if I say no," he said, "then I take Harwick's 12 signatures to the formal council and I make the argument there," she said. "And the council decides." She held his eyes. "I'm asking you first because I would rather you understand this as a necessary correction than experience it as a consequence." He sat with that. The candles were very low. The room had the quality of the late hours, the honest, stripped quality that arrives when ceremony has been exhausted, and what is left is just people in a room with the actual shape of things between them. "My father," Cedric said. He stopped, started again. "When my father was dying, he told me something. He said the hardest part of ruling was knowing what you were protecting it for. He said most kings lost track of that within the first 5 years and spent the rest of their reigns protecting the position instead of the purpose. He looked at his hands. I thought I understood what he meant. She waited. I didn't, he said. No, she said. You didn't. She said it without cruelty and without comfort, because it was simply true, and he deserved the true version. He looked up at her. Royal Chancellor, he said. Yes. He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached across the table, not toward her, just toward the center, where the pen lay. And he picked it up. He pulled the charter toward him. He found the provision. She had flagged it already, 2 hours ago, when she was working through the documents with the provision already in mind. He read it. He put the pen to the reinstatement clause. He signed it. He signed it with his personal seal, the man's seal rather than the crown's, and she watched him do it and felt the specific weight of a door opening that had been closed for 60 years. She did not feel triumphant. She had thought about this moment, in fragments, across various hours of the last 2 days, and she had anticipated that when it came, it would have the quality of triumph, of resolution, of something finally arriving after a long wait. It did not feel like that. It felt like the beginning of a great deal of work, which was perhaps the most honest feeling available to someone who had spent 32 years building things. She took the pen from him. She signed below his signature. The reinstatement clause had a provision for a second signature, the countersigning authority of an independent witness or the departing holder of the office. She used the Royal Chancellor's administrative seal she had pressed to the letter for Harwick, the one she had found in the back of her administrative memory, because she had read every provision of the founding charter twice and had cross-referenced the seal catalog in her second year out of the specific habit of a person who believed in reading the entire document. She set the pen down. She looked at the signed charter. She thought about what it had cost to reach this table, not in the abstract, specifically. The cold of the lower fortress, the wet scarf. The specific loneliness of a cell when the footsteps of the guards have retreated and there is nothing left but dark and the sound of water and the company of your own mind. She had not fallen apart in those hours, and she was not going to perform the falling apart now that they were over, but she allowed herself, briefly, to acknowledge that they had happened, that they had been real, that the specific form of damage done to her, the public stripping, the theater of humiliation, the precise staging of her worthlessness, had landed somewhere inside her and would take time to clear. She did not hold it against Cedric in this moment, because holding it did not help the next thing, and she was constitutionally incapable of holding a thing that had no functional use. But she acknowledged it. That was new. That was perhaps the thing the lower fortress had given her that she had not had before. The specific permission, internal and earned and belonging to no one else, to acknowledge damage without immediately converting it into strategy. She stood up. Get some sleep, she said. Both of us. The formal council convenes at noon tomorrow. She picked up the signed charter. I'll inform Harwick that his 3 additional signatures are no longer required. Cedric looked at her. Serafina, he said. She stopped. He looked at the table, at the signed charter, at everything the room contained. He had the expression of a man who wants to say something large and has discovered that the large things resist the specific forms language provides, that they keep slipping out of the sentences you build for them. I know, she said. She left him there. The corridor outside was quiet. Fisk was at the door and he looked at her as she came out with the contained, assessing attention he brought to everything, and he read whatever he read in her face, and face said nothing about it. The prisoners, he said. Secured until the council convenes at noon, she said. Halverson has the staging point situation. I need you to send a messenger to Lord Harwick telling him the convening is proceeding with royal consent. He'll understand what that means. She looked at him. And Fisk, Your Majesty. The lower fortress guard, the man who let Lena Morrow through the corridor door on the first night. She paused. Make sure he's kept on. Fisk's expression did not change, but something in it settled slightly. Yes, Your Majesty, he said. She walked. Through the east corridor and down the main stair and through the Queen's hall, her hall, the one she had walked 100 times, and she did not stop until she reached her office. The office that had been searched, the desk that had been gone through, the correspondence pulled, the materials taken and recontextualized into a case against her. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. The room had been put back, not carefully, but functionally. The papers were not in the order she kept them. The desk chair was at the wrong angle. Someone had moved the smaller correspondence tray to the wrong side of the desk. She went in. She moved the tray back. She straightened the chair. She sat down. She sat at her desk in her office at 2 a.m. with the signed charter in her hands and the candle burning low, and outside the window, the capital city quiet. The harvest lanterns long since gone out on the river. The music from the lower districts silent. She thought about Lena Morrow in the kitchen, who had taken a wool scarf off her own back and pushed it through the bars of a cell door because her grandmother had cleaned these floors, and she did not want someone to be cold. She thought about Gerard and Marin and Corvin, who had come to a dungeon corridor when they had been told not to, who had carried things in their hands and their coats and their careful memories because they had decided, independently and without coordination, that the correct thing was to show up. She thought about Halverson, who had read a nonsense message about grain routes that didn't exist and had understood immediately and had moved. She thought about all of it. The specific texture of how a thing holds together when it holds together. The individual threads of it. The places where it had almost broken, and the places where it had held because someone had done something small and unremarkable and entirely necessary. Power was not a clean thing. She had never believed it was. Power was accountable in inverse proportion to its security, and the version of power she had held for 6 years, the informal kind, the unacknowledged kind, the kind that disappeared the moment the man who permitted it changed his mind, had been the most vulnerable form of it. She had worked within it anyway because she had believed in the work. She still believed in the work. What she was building now was different, not because she had won something. Winning was the wrong word for what had happened in this building tonight. What she had done was survive, and then correct, and then construct the conditions for correction to persist. That was not a victory. That was maintenance. The specific, unglamorous, essential maintenance of a system that could not maintain itself. She looked at the charter. She thought about the dungeon that had held her, which would need to be addressed. The conditions there were exactly as she had reported in her 3rd year, and nothing had changed. She would put that on the council agenda. Not symbolically, practically. People were still in those cells, and the cells were not habitable in any standard she was willing to defend. She thought about the Variant land claim, which had legitimate grounds that had been buried in corrupted proceedings, and which would require a real review and possibly a real correction. That would be complicated. That would require navigating the specific sensitivities of lords who had benefited from the original outcome. She would do it anyway. She thought about Aldrin, about the question of what you did with a man who had served well for years and broken under targeted pressure and had come back to the room under his own power and sat at the table and listened to his own account be delivered by the man who had used him. She would give him the chance to repair it, not because she had forgotten what he had done, because the institution needed people who had made mistakes and understood the shape of them, and because she was building something that had to be able to survive human failure, which meant it had to have room for people who had failed and had returned. She would watch him carefully. She would watch everyone carefully. That was the work. Outside the window, the first suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate itself from the dark. Not light yet, just the specific quality of dark that precedes it, the place where black becomes the deep blue of something getting ready to change. She watched it for a while. She was 32 years old. She had been queen for 6 years, and she had not been queen for 2 days, and she was now something that had no precedent in living memory, and that would require, before the Noon Council, a formal correspondence protocol and an administrative structure and a meeting with the Charter Review Office and a document establishing the reporting relationships between the Chancellor's office and the ministerial appointments. She picked up the pen. She began to write. Not the correspondence. That could wait until she had slept, which she would, for 2 hours. The specific compressed sleep of someone who had learned to extract maximum recovery from minimum time because the alternative was a body that made poor decisions. Before the sleep, she wanted this, the outline of the administrative structure, the bones of it, the thing she had been carrying in her head in the form of a framework for 36 hours, and that needed to be on paper before it drifted. She wrote the way she had always written. quickly, without circling the point, going straight to the load-bearing elements and working outward from there. She wrote about accountability structures and reporting chains and the specific provisions that would need to be encoded to prevent a future holder of this office from being removed by informal royal decision. She wrote about the Treasury oversight protocols and the Foreign Correspondence Review function and the ministerial accountability mechanism that would require formal council approval to override. She wrote about the dungeon. She wrote about it specifically, practically, with the same register she brought to everything else. The conditions requiring remediation, the timeline for remediation, the oversight mechanism that would confirm it had occurred. She did not write about what it had meant to be inside it. That was not what the document was for. What it was for was ensuring that the next person in those cells, whoever they were, for whatever reason, was not held in conditions she would not have tolerated for a livestock facility. She wrote until the dawn was real, until the light through the window had shifted from blue to the specific pale gray that preceded gold, until the capital city below began its early morning movements. The sound of cartwheels on cobblestones, a dog, the distant call of the river workers starting their shift. She set the pen down. She looked at what she had written. She thought, this is the beginning, not the end. She did not feel the specific finality of endings. What she felt was the much less satisfying and much more accurate sensation of a thing entering its next phase. The phase where the dramatic portion was over and the sustained, unglamorous labor of implementation began. The phase most stories skipped. The phase she had always found, in practice, to be the hardest and the most important. She stood up. She carried her papers to the window and held them in the morning light to check the margins, to confirm the handwriting was legible, to see the words in a quality of light that was not candle and was not dungeon, but was just the ordinary dawn of an ordinary day at the beginning of something that did not have a name yet. She thought about Lena Morrow's scarf. She had left it on the pallet in the lower fortress. She would have it retrieved. She would have it laundered and returned to Lena with something attached to it. Not money. Lena had not done what she did for money, but something that acknowledged the specific nature of what had been offered. A note, maybe. The kind of note that said, I saw you. What you did was seen. People needed to know when they had been seen. That was perhaps the simplest thing she had learned in 32 years, and the thing most consistently forgotten by everyone in a position to act on it. She set the papers down. She went to the window and looked out at the capital. The city was waking. The river was silver in the early light, the harvest lanterns gone, the water moving with its ordinary indifference to what happened on the banks. The lower districts were the first to show movement, the working quarter, the market quarter, the docks. Then the middle ring. Then up here, the administrative quarter, the palace district, where the day's first servants were crossing the yard and the garrison was changing its overnight watch with the sound of boots on stone and the clipped exchanges of the shift handover. She watched it. She thought about what it had taken to be standing here at this window, watching this city wake up. About the specific chain of decisions and actions and people all the way back through the last 2 days that had made it possible. About the kitchen girl who had been first in the chain, the simplest link, the one with the least power and the clearest instinct. She thought, I will build something that deserves that, not a promise to the city or to the court, or to the charter, or to Cedric, or to the council. A promise to Lena Morrow and Gerart and Marin and Corvin and Halverson and the 23 garrison veterans who had been transferred out of eastern posts and had stayed loyal anyway, and to Aldrin sitting in a room with the full weight of what he had done, and to Harwick, who had ridden to the outer city and convened lords in a public room within 2 hours of being stripped because some people understood what they owed to something larger than themselves and acted on it without being asked. To all of them. She would build something that deserved that. The window light was fully gold now, below, in the lower fortress. She could not see it from here, could not see any of it, just the gray outer wall of the older structure. The dungeon that had held her was cold and wet and exactly as it had been for the last 3 decades. And in the months ahead, she would change that, specifically and practically, with the specific and practical authority she now held. But for now, it was still what it had been. She looked at it, the wall that was all she could see of it, and she thought about sitting in that cell with a borrowed scarf and a pen and a blanket, and the full unfiltered awareness of her own mind. with nothing to recommend her except what she had built in her head across 32 years and what she had distributed through relationships and systems and the invisible, uncredited infrastructure of a kingdom that had worked because she had made it work. She had gone into that cell a queen. She was walking out of it as something for which there was, as yet, no settled word. That seemed right. The things worth becoming rarely arrived with their names already decided. She turned from the window. She picked up her papers. She went to find somewhere to sleep for 2 hours before the work began again. Below her, in the lower fortress, the cell that had held her stood empty, its door ajar, the thin morning light from the slit window falling across the pallet where she had sat and thought and built the shape of what came next. And the wool scarf lay folded on top of the blanket, exactly where she had left it, dark blue and plain and warm with the specific warmth of something given freely, waiting to be returned.